Hello, welcome everyone to the stream. So, as the title indicates, today I'm going to be talking about this video that was produced by Capturing Christianity and Joe Schmidt. Well, Joe Schmidt was on Capturing Christianity, titled "The Three Biggest Mistakes Made by Atheists." And specifically, they're talking about or focusing on YouTube atheism or atheist popularizers on YouTube, which is fine. So I was sort of intrigued by this video. Obviously, it's a collab between Joe Schmidt, who's an agnostic, and I know does quite a lot of good work, and Capturing Christianity. So that's sort of an interesting angle there. And the topic is interesting because, you know, mistakes made by atheists. There's certainly plenty of those. And I wanted to see what they had to say about it. And I came into the video, you know, kind of wanting to like it because, you know, there's a lot to criticize about the way atheism is often presented and the talking points and so forth. I've written about some of this before, although I've not talked about it as much on my YouTube channel. I'll get to that at some point. But so I was sort of primed to enjoy the video, but actually, I really hated it. I think this is a terrible video. So I felt it was necessary to produce a response. So here we are. So at the outset, I want to say that there absolutely are a lot of mistakes or, you know, bad arguments, bad points made by atheists broadly and atheists on YouTube. So I'm not disputing that. And I also think that, you know, they do make a number of good points in this video at places. So it's not all bad, right? But I think that there's also a lot of really bad points made. And just, if not outright mistakes, at least misrepresentations or oversimplifications or not being charitable or, you know, at different points, it's can be expressed differently. But yeah, overall, I was really not impressed by this video. So I guess I need to explain why. And so that's what I'm going to be doing here. I'm just going to go straight through it and review the whole thing. So we're going to start here, just jumping a few minutes in where they're talking about, so we've got Cameron and Joe, where they're talking about where they got the idea for the video in response to this post by Rationality Rules. And yeah, then we'll just get right into it then.
The community post from Rationality Rules one more time. So this is kind of like stealing his idea. So sorry about that, Stephen. I'm sure that your video will be a whole lot different from this if that makes it any better. But I thought it was a good idea to kind of give our take on what our response is. I mean, he did ask the question, what are your three? So all right, here it is. My next video, I'm going to be, no, that sounds Australian. I'm just going to
read it normally.
In my next video, I'm going to be expressing what I consider the three biggest mistakes made by atheists. And despite my already having written the first draft, I thought, why not utilize the community tab to ask you lovely lot what you consider to be the biggest mistakes? If I find any of your suggestions better than mine, I'll borrow them, which is what we're doing here. We're borrowing this idea, all whilst, of course, graciously affording credit. But honestly, I doubt you'll top mine. You won't believe number three. We won't believe it, Joe. We won't believe it. All right, you take the last.
Take the last. Yeah, so what says you? Other than neckbeards, what's the three biggest mistakes made by atheists?
All right, so that's what we're talking.
A question for chat or for comments on this video. So I've been wondering, neckbeards are to atheists as what is to theists, or maybe Christians. Let's make it more specific. So neckbeards are to atheists as what is to Christians. Like what is the neckbeard equivalent of in Christianity? I'm just curious. Because nothing comes to mind. I'm sure people will be able to come up with something.
About today, the three biggest mistakes. We're borrowing, in scare quotes, this idea. So thank you, Stephen, for the idea of the show. And let's get, so what we're going to do though, and I didn't tell you this beforehand, but let's do the list backwards. So like your top three, and I don't know if you've got them in that order, like the top one is, I don't know if you have it like that in the first place, but I guess I kind of do. So we'll start with your number three, then we'll do mine. So we have different lists here. So that's another thing to keep in mind as we're going through this. Hopefully we don't have any overlap, but we'll see. So give me your number three first. We'll talk about that a little bit, then we'll go to my number three. What is your number three?
Okay. My number three was actually has the demonstration involved. So I've got a demonstration. The title of it is the no evidence mantra. So you oftentimes hear on internet atheist communities and whatnot, which is largely what we're focusing on, a kind of more new atheist type people. You often hear them say that there's no evidence for the existence of God, or there's no evidence for theism, or there's no evidence for Christianity, and on down the list. Now, I think this is a pretty big mistake, and it has to do with what evidence is. So to illustrate that, I doodled this. Now, I'm a professional artist, as you can see. So we've got two jars, okay? Jar one and jar, let's see if I can do this backwards. Jar one, jar two. Okay, so we got jar one and jar two. Jar two has 8 orange jelly beans. We're gonna call these jelly beans because we want to. And it's got 2 black jelly beans. And then jar one has 8 black jelly beans and 2 orange jelly beans. Okay, so I'm going to perform some magic here. I'm gonna put this away. Remember, jar two has predominantly orange. Jar one is predominantly black. I'm gonna put that away. Bada bing, bada boom. I draw a jelly bean and it is orange. You can see that, hopefully. Let me get the lighting. Anyway, it's orange, you can trust me. Yeah. So the question is, which of these do you think that came from? Now, I think it's obvious that we should conclude that probably it came from 2, right? Well, why is that? Well, because jar 2 has mostly orange jelly beans. And you can actually kind of formalize this, right? You can say getting an orange jelly bean is evidence for the fact that we took jelly bean from jar 2 because the data, namely an orange jelly bean, is more expected on the hypothesis that we drew from 2 than it is on the hypothesis that we drew from 1. It's more expected. It's more likely. We would predict the data more on the hypothesis that we drew from jar 2 than if we drew from jar 1. So with that out of the way, that's a kind of how philosophers and philosophers of science and scientists themselves often conceive of evidence. Evidence is something that is more expected on a hypothesis, like you have a greater probability or expectation of seeing it, a greater likelihood of seeing it, than on the negation of that hypothesis, or perhaps on a relevant alternative hypothesis. So it's all about probability raising. Evidence is probability raising. And how do you raise that probability? You have some piece of evidence that is more expected on a hypothesis than on a competing hypothesis. So do you have any questions so far?
Do I have questions? No, I think that's pretty straightforward. Yeah, you're just talking about confirmation theory. How probability theory works. And
as basic as I can. I don't want to get into all the equations and whatnot. But so that's what evidence is, okay? And with that in mind, the claim that there was no evidence for theism or for God's existence is quite implausible, very implausible. Yeah, that is to say. It's very, very implausible. And why is that? Well, because there do seem to be things that are much more expected on theism than on the relevant alternatives, let's say naturalism, right? So consider the existence of free conscious moral agents, right? So plausibly, free conscious moral agents are incredibly valuable. Okay.
Let me pause you. Yeah, this is a good place to pause. First of all, I want to comment on the fact that your glasses are broken. This makes you look like 10 times smarter. You've got some tape on it. That's comment number 1. Comment number 2 is it should be important to note to people, if you don't know who Joe is, he's an agnostic. He's not a Christian. He's not an atheist. So when he's talking about these things, he's saying that there is evidence for theism, for Christianity, whatever. But it's important to know that background. So a lot of maybe that should have made it into one of the mistakes. But one of the mistakes you can make is that someone is just like biased toward this conclusion. But as an agnostic, you could maybe try to make that argument, but I don't think you could make it successfully. But it's just some important background information to keep in mind as he's talking about evidence. So that's it. Just continue.
All right, that's a good place for me to pause it. So there's quite a few things here, and Joe will continue to discuss this further. So I'm going to be quite critical of Joe throughout this video because he does most of the talking. Again, I think I don't really know him. I've interacted with him only sort of indirectly a few times. As far as I can tell, he's a nice guy and does some good stuff, and he knows philosophy well. But I do think he, again, I was going to say makes mistakes in this video. I think that's maybe a bit strong because some of it may come down to differences of opinion, but I do think that there are some problems with some of the things that he says. So anyway, I just want to preface that by like I don't have anything personal against the guy, and maybe we can chat about it in person sometime. But that being said, so let's with respect to my question, neckbeards are atheists as neckbeards are Christians. That maybe that's the. I mean, I hoped it was something more interesting than that, but maybe that's as good as it gets. Anyway, so. On the notion of what evidence is, I don't really have any particular problem with the way that Joe described it, as evidence is something that sort of raises the likelihood of one hypothesis relative to another, or raises the conditional probability of that hypothesis relative to another on that evidence. I think that's fine. Now, Joe thinks that there is evidence for theism. Well, we'll get to that in a moment. I do think, however, broadly that saying that there is no evidence for theism or no evidence for Christianity is a mistake. Although I don't think it's a very big mistake. I think that it's mainly just an oversimplification or maybe a slip of the tongue, or it just sort of is easier to say than no good evidence, which often, and they actually mention this later, is what people mean. They just mean there's no good or persuasive evidence. Now, Joe actually has a problem with that, which we'll get to. But so I do, and I've said this before, atheists should never say that there's no evidence for theism. Just say that there's no good or persuasive or compelling evidence. I think that's much clearer, and it's just sort of easier to defend, because the thing is, to say that there's no evidence for something like means that there's literally no observation that favors that over an alternative. And especially because in a lot of cases, it's sort of ambiguous or unclear whether something is evidence for, theism or not. To just categorically say that there's just none is really strong. And I think that there's really very little to be gained in trying to make that stronger claim. It's best to just say, look, I don't think there's any persuasive evidence, or there's no good arguments, or even better, it's just none of the arguments I've heard I find persuasive, something like that. So that's, I agree that it is a mistake. I just don't think it's a particularly big mistake, because it's usually, I think it's clear what someone means, and it's sort of easy to clear up. So that's what I want to say about that. Now, another point here, which may seem kind of irrelevant, but I actually think it is relevant, is the fact that Cameron mentioned that Joe's an agnostic. This will come up later in a number of respects. This is why I'm flagging it here. So I differ from Joe in that I'm not an agnostic, I'm an atheist. And I guess by the standards of things, a pretty what do they say? Hard-nosed, hardcore, whatever terms that they like to use to describe atheists, right? So I'm a naturalist as well, so that makes it even worse, right? And I get the impression, I mean, this is my sort of take on things, so feel free to disagree, but people like Cameron and other internet apologists, they sort of, maybe, I don't know if like's the right word, but they much prefer agnostics to atheists. And I think the reason is because they believe that atheism is very close-minded. Well, how can you just, believe that God doesn't exist? Like, how can you prove a negative? Or what about all the arguments? They think that at least agnostics are sort of open-minded. And you even see one of the commenters, I think, or maybe it was Cameron, I forget, at the end of the video says, oh, Joe's going to become a Christian soon, kind of thing. Like that's the sort of idea, like that they like to think about agnostics as like open-minded, not yet Christians kind of thing. And whereas atheists, they think of as typically like closed-minded and skeptical, like overly skeptical and so forth. So I think that's interesting. I think that it's interesting how that plays out over the course of the video and the comments that come in, and you'll see there. And I think that it's important for atheists to be cautious precisely because of this sort of reputation that precedes us as being closed-minded and angry and all of this stuff. So yeah, I just thought that's an interesting observation that will sort of come up a bit later in the video. Anyway, so that's some general remarks. So to summarize, yes, atheists shouldn't say that there's literally no evidence for theism or Christianity. Just say that there's no good or persuasive evidence. Now, let's see what... So at the moment, I don't disagree too much. I just think it's a particularly big problem. But it's where Joe goes with this where I start to disagree more.
Yeah. So, no, that's good. That's good. Yeah. Some people... That's also another mistake, like you said. Like if I'm arguing for Proposition P or arguing against Proposition P, that doesn't mean that I believe or disbelieve Proposition P. It just means I'm arguing, right? I could have countervailing evidence on some side. Anyway, setting that aside, the data. Let's pick a piece of data. So this will be like an orange jelly bean. That'll be the existence of conscious, free, moral agents. Okay. Now, plausibly, conscious, free, moral agents have tremendous value, right? It's like, we don't think that stepping on a rock is morally bad, but we do tend to think that, say, stepping on like a toddler, like or like torturing a toddler, that's pretty bad. Okay. And so these kinds of beings have tremendous value. And moreover, the fact that they are free and conscious and that they find themselves in a kind of arena in which they can make morally significant decisions, that can facilitate, if God exists, that can facilitate a relationship like between these creatures and God, which is presumably one of the greatest goods possible. And so given the fact that the existence of conscious, moral, free agents, given the fact that this is incredibly valuable, has great goods, we would conclude on that, well, God at least has some reason to produce them. God has some desire. God has some reason to produce them because God's perfect. God aims towards things that are good and valuable and whatnot. But by contrast, under naturalism, it's not at all clear that you have this kind of probability-raising effect or this kind of greater expectability. Why is that? Well, by many naturalists' own lights, our existence was not intended by anything. Nothing is trying to bring about profoundly valuable sentient creatures. First of all, you have to get over a bunch of probability hurdles, right? You have to have a life-permitting universe. You have to have an evolutionary process that has to go on sufficiently long and with sufficiently detailed laws of nature that allow for a complex brain structure that can support consciousness and whatnot. You also have to have a kind of irreducible freedom that's responsive to reasons and whatnot. So you have to have all these sorts of probability hurdles. And naturalism doesn't seem to provide the resources to raise the probability there and make it more expected than it would be on theism. And so, because this is an orange jelly bean, it's more expected on the hypothesis of theism than it is on naturalism. It provides at least some evidence for theism. So that's just a counterexample of their claim that there's no evidence whatsoever.
Yeah, and one thing that I point out, because so someone pointed out in the live chat, there's like, okay, that's not the claim. The claim is not that there's no evidence.
Oops, wanted to pause it a bit sooner there. So, sorry, I was just looking at what chat said. So Joe here has basically offered an argument for theism. He's not saying it's a decisive argument. He's not even saying whether he agrees with this argument, right? But he presents it as evidence in favor of theism. Now, the thing is, given what he just said about the definition of evidence, evidence is something that, like a consideration or phenomena or whatever, that is more probable under one hypothesis than another, effectively. So it seems that by offering this argument here, which let's say it's a broadly teleological type argument, so I'll just call it the teleological argument just to simplify, right? In offering this argument as an example of evidence in favor of theism, even if he doesn't think it's necessarily particularly persuasive, he would at least have to think that it raises the probability of theism relative to naturalism. And that appears to be what he said, right? So I want to emphasize here, I'm not saying that Joe is claiming that this argument is ultimately persuasive, but he does seem to be claiming that it's evidence raising, that it is evidence for theism over naturalism. Now, the question is, do we have to agree with that as, say, a naturalist myself? even though, as they point out later, naturalism and atheism are not the same thing, but we'll get to that. But I mean, I'm a naturalist, so fine. I'm happy to look at it from that point of view. Now, I don't accept that that kind of teleological argument does raise the probability of theism relative to atheism. Perhaps there are some forms of the teleological argument that might. I'm not ruling that out, right? But the way that Joe just articulated there and the way that I've heard it articulated by many theists, I think is not persuasive and really doesn't change the probability at all. I talked more about this in the debate with fine-tuning that I had with Luke Barnes a couple of weeks ago or the other week. But I mean, I think there's a lot of problems with that line of argument. Again, I'll just sort of sketch a few of them here. One point is that you do have to have certain moral commitments to the idea that, say, conscious beings with free will have independent moral value. A lot of theists who go along with a sort of Craigian moral argument won't accept that, because such beings only have value because of God's commandments with respect to them. And so it's not like God has sort of independent moral reasons to create any particular state of affairs. Another way of framing that is, did the sort of moral standing of reality improve when God created these, human beings? And it would seem to be, according to what Joe said, that it is, that's the reason that God has to create them, because it's sort of morally better to have them than not have them. But that just won't work under sort of strong forms of divine command theory, which says that like God is purely self-sufficient and morality derives from his commands, which derive from his nature. And it's not like that there's some sort of external moral facts which are sort of in virtue of which God makes his actions. I don't think that's going to work under that sort of divine command theory. So sure, a theist doesn't have to accept that, but many of them do. So already that branch of argument is not going to work. But suppose that you do accept that. I think Richard Swinburne agrees with that line that, okay, Craig's moral argument doesn't work because there are these sort of moral facts that God can sort of act with respect to that are independent of him in some sense. But then you have to ask the question, well, would we expect to see the type of universe that we do see? Would we expect to see a universe that is as old and mostly as empty as we do? What is it about being embodied that makes something more morally valuable than not being embodied? Is having libertarian free will really morally significant? I actually not convinced of that at all. Wouldn't it be morally better if God created beings who were morally perfect, or at least much morally better than we currently are? You have all of these questions that roll off, right? And basically, although theists, of course, can, there's things that they can say in response. The point I'm simply making is that I don't accept that this sort of teleological type argument is evidence in favor of theism or in Christianity. I don't think it raises the probability at all, not as stated, right? Maybe there's forms that do, but at least this general kind of argument as stated. So coming back to the point of the argument, right? What Joe is trying to say is that, well, there is at least some evidence in favor of theism, right? And he's trying to give this as an example. And what I'm trying to say is, well, I don't have to accept that that's evidence, right? And I've just given a sketch of some reasons why not. But I mean, obviously what I've said is not supposed to be a full rebuttal. It's just giving the idea that I don't have to accept those reasons. And maybe then Joe would say, well, okay, here's another type of reason that could count in favor of theism. But again, I can just say, well, I don't think that that is evidence in favor of theism, and here's why, and I'll give my reasons. So the point here is that just because some people say that something is a reason, that is that these considerations favor one postulate over the other, one worldview over the other, that doesn't mean that we have to accept that, right? If you have a different view of it, then you're going to argue for that view and you're going to think differently. So just because some theists, and maybe agnostics as well, think that certain things are probability raising with respect to theism over naturalism, that doesn't mean that naturalists have to agree with that. So I don't quite understand how this is supposed to be an argument against the notion that atheists are not allowed to say that there's no evidence, or as you said, no good evidence for the existence of God, because they could just not be persuaded, not think that these things are evidential. And that's what I would say with respect to, and I think people like Oppie and Malpass as well would say with respect to most, if not all, theistic arguments. They just don't think they're evidential. They don't think they're good arguments. So Joe may disagree with that, and he's perfect. Cameron as well, may perfectly fine for them to disagree. But I don't think it's going to work for them to say, well, you can't say there's no evidence because at the very least we've got these arguments, right? There's surely some evidence. But then the atheists can just say, well, no, we don't think that these things are evidential at all. And so, it's the discussion isn't really progressed just by sort of asserting that you have an argument. Anyway, hopefully I've made the point there. Let's move on.
The claim is that there's no good evidence. That's something that someone pointed out. You can maybe talk about that in a second, but I wanted to point out that a lot of times when people make this assertion, which does happen, there was a video that I actually responded to personally from the Friendly Atheist. What is his name? Hemant Mehta? I think that's the way to say his last name, Mehta. Anyways, he did say that. He has this video that's 2 minutes long. It's 20 different arguments for atheism. The first one is there's no evidence. That's all he says. One of the things I point out is that a lot of times when this argument is made, or if you want to call it an argument, whenever the statement is made, it's normally not followed up by any evidence or any argument for the truth of this claim. So it's almost self-defeating in that sense. If there's no evidence for theism, yet when you claim this, you normally don't provide evidence for that claim. It's kind of self-defeating in some way. And I like to at least draw attention to that if you're going to make this claim, then maybe it's a good idea to say something a little bit more about it if you want to make the claim. So one of the ways that someone will clarify is they'll say, well, there's just no good evidence for theism. So what do you think about that? If they kind of twist it a little bit or just give a little bit more clarity, say there's no good evidence.
Yeah, so this is what I said before. The idea that, well, it's not that there's no evidence, there's no good evidence. And I think that's a better thing to say. Or probably better again is to say, be a bit more clear, say there's no persuasive evidence, or I don't find the arguments convincing, or I don't think the arguments are very compelling, something along those lines, right? There's different things one could say, depending on the exact context. And so I think that that's the better thing to say. With respect to the idea that you can just say there's no evidence, so we actually do that all the time, right? So if someone asks you, why don't you believe in reincarnation? You probably just say, well, there's no evidence for reincarnation, right? Someone tells you, asks you, do you believe in fairies? Apart from the cosmic fairies, right? Well, we know cosmic fairies exist, so that's probably a bad example, right? But if someone asks you, why don't you believe in Bigfoot? Actually, that's a good example because a lot of people do believe in Bigfoot. You say, well, I don't think there's any evidence for Bigfoot. You see, this is a very standard thing we do. If someone asks you about something, about a claim or a position, and you don't believe in it, it's a pretty standard thing to not believe in something because there's no evidence for it. Or again, the more careful claim would be you find the evidence that people give unsatisfactory. So there's no good evidence. I don't think that needs to be qualified. Obviously, it depends, like that's a discourse specific fact there. So whether you need to qualify or expand on that depends on the context. But the point is, it's not clear to me that you sort of always, as a general rule, that you always have to explain why you don't think there's good evidence or compelling evidence. Because I just think that's a perfectly acceptable locution that you can just say, I don't think there's any good evidence for that. That's why I don't believe. Like that's perfectly fine. It goes in reverse as well. It's perfectly acceptable for the theist to say, I believe in God because I think there's good evidence. Again, they don't always have to explain what the evidence is. It depends on the context. It depends on the discussion. So you don't always have to justify your position. You can just say that you think there's good or bad evidence. Depends on the context of the discussion to whether you need to get into that. So I don't really see why Cameron is sort of so upset about that. Christians make all sorts of claims all the time about things that they don't justify. But, depending on the context, it's fine. They don't have to always justify their beliefs. It's just, of course, if you're in a conversation where that's the point of the discussion, then it's not going to be enough just to say, I don't believe because there's not enough evidence. And in that sense, I do think that atheists can go wrong. If it's a debate about the existence of God, right, and you're just going to say there's no evidence, well, that's not really satisfactory because the whole point is to debate that proposition. So you're going to need to say a bit more than that. But anyway, so again, I don't disagree too much. I just think that this can be interpreted a bit more charitably. But where Joe goes here is a bit strange because Cameron's asked him, okay, so what about the idea that there's no good evidence for the existence of God? And well, let's have a listen to what he has to say.
As an agnostic, I mean, what do you think about that?
I don't quite understand. I feel like Peter Van Inwagen, I don't understand what you're saying, but
which is like the most. It's like the best comeback you can give in a philosophical context.
Yeah, I don't quite understand what this distinction is between good evidence and bad evidence. Like, okay, so listen, evidence is probability raising, right? It's like I said, it's the orange jelly bean. It's like, again, consider our cases. Like, is the orange jelly bean good evidence or not? I mean, like, I can quantify it for you. Like, I can run the probability calculus and whatnot, and put the numbers in. But like, evidence is evidence, right? Like, it either raises the probability of the hypothesis or not. Now, maybe what they're saying is, well, it doesn't raise the probability by a lot. Like, it doesn't raise it so much.
But then I don't think that's what they're saying. I don't think it's like, oh, it just doesn't do it enough. I think they still want to say it doesn't do it at all.
Well, exactly. And also, like, the purpose of these arguments is not to raise the probability enough so as to make you, compel you to believe it or something. Rather, the purpose is indeed modest. It's just to say, hey, here's a piece of evidence. Let's take this into account when we're making our overall probability assessment of the world views. And so it's just one weight of evidence. And it might be stronger or weaker for some people, depending on, their priors and all the other sorts of things. But the fact that it is evidence is a weight. It's a weight. No one's saying that it has to completely tip the scales. We're just saying that it's placed on a scale.
Right. Okay, let's move on.
All right. So here I'm finding myself disagreeing more with Joel, and it's going to increase more as we go through. So he said Joel doesn't know what it means to say something is good evidence. That strikes me as a completely bizarre claim because we use this dialogue all the time. Maybe not in, so this is not a precise philosophical claim. I agree with that, right? If you're writing a philosophy paper or whatever, you don't just want to use the term like good evidence because that's not precise enough. You want to quantify it maybe in Bayesian terms or in, I don't know, abductive reasoning or whatever specific form of inference you're using. Sure, I agree with that. But everyday language isn't a philosophy paper. It's perfectly acceptable and standard to say this is good evidence, this is bad evidence. Well, what do you think law courts are like? They assess the quality of evidence, essentially. Even scientific journals, scientists talk about good and bad evidence all the time, right? In more or less that word. using that language. So there's no real problem here. Well, you might ask, well, what exactly do people mean by good evidence? Well, I mean, it's not necessarily clear that they mean exactly one thing in all cases. In some cases, I think what they mean when they say things are bad evidence is that people claim, say Christians claim that, say, the teleological argument is evidence for God, whereas the atheist thinks that it is not evidence. So they'll say it's bad evidence. What they mean by that is they don't actually think it is evidential. They just, if you like, you could say, well, they're not being super precise. But I mean, natural language isn't always super precise, and that's fine. I think everyone basically knows what they mean when they say, look, I don't find that is good evidence. You might ask them to clarify in probabilistic terms if you like, but I mean, it means they don't find it persuasive. They don't think it counts in favor of the proposition. I mean, I think it's fairly clear. Now, in a different context, someone might say that something's bad evidence because they think it is evidence. It does raise the probability, but only by a tiny, tiny amount. So that's slightly different to saying that it is literally not evidence. But practically, it doesn't really, like, what difference does it make if something raises the evidence by a tiny amount, raises the probability by a tiny amount or by literally zero? It doesn't really matter practically. So I think that this idea that, oh, I don't know what it means for something to be good evidence. Yes, we know, everyone knows what it means for something to be good or bad evidence. In a philosophy paper context, yes, you will want to be more precise than that. In a conversation, in I think nearly all contexts, it's fine, and it's generally clear what people mean. So I don't really see the issue here. When people say that they think that the evidence for God is unsatisfactory or bad, it means that they think it's of low quality, it's not persuasive, it's of low evidentiary value, maybe even exactly no evidentiary value, but I don't think it really matters that much to distinguish those. It means that they think it is not as good as it should be. It means that they think that there's a lot of biases and uncontrolled variables, if you like, with the evidence presented. The arguments have premises that are questionable. Maybe the arguments are invalid. It depends on exactly what type of evidence is being referred to. But, it means this sort of combination of things, right? So it is vague, but also sufficiently clear what is meant in general. So I just don't really understand. And we'll see this going forward. The way Joe approaches some of this stuff, it's like whenever anyone makes a claim in any context, it's like it has to be philosophically precise. And although I am a fan of sort of precision and philosophical reasoning, I'm not going to say that this has to be the case in like every instance when anyone talks about atheism and Christianity or religion more generally. So I think this is one example of this. It's perfectly fine to say that the evidence is good or bad. I think in most contexts, most people know what you mean.
On to my third biggest mistake that atheists make. How long do we spend on that? About 15 minutes. So we'll maybe spend a little bit less time on the rest. That involves a demonstration, everything else.
Yeah, I had a demonstration,
I also don't have that much to say.
All right, so they're moving on now to the next one. So the first one was that atheists should stop saying there's no evidence. Broadly, I agree, but I don't think it's really that much of an issue because, well, they probably just mean there's no good evidence, and I don't think there's a problem with atheists saying that. In general, in certain contexts, they need to do more. Like if it's a debate, yeah, you can't just say there's no evidence and then sit there. That's kind of like you're supposed to debate the discussion, right? But in general, I don't have a problem with that. But again, look, if that was all it was, I wouldn't worry too much. This video, I think, it sort of gets worse. So we'll see what the next point is.
In terms of like an illustration of how it goes, but I will reference a couple different times that I've seen it. And this is from my experience as well. So I've been doing apologetics, especially online, for a long time. So coming up on a decade here. So I've seen a lot of different things on both sides, and that was one of the things we talked about before we did this. Is that like it was difficult to find things that were sort of atheist specific. So some of the things that I'll talk about also apply to theists, and so it's kind of just like an attack on just bad.
What? Some of the mistakes also apply to theists? I'm shocked. Heaven forbid that theists do most of the same bad things that atheists do. Anyway, I'm not really interested in a quote, oh, well, theists do this as well. Like, yeah, so what? But I don't know. I found that comment amusing.
Thinking in general. So and this again can apply to theists, but I think it's often seen in YouTube atheism. So my number third is my third biggest mistake that atheists make is that they attack the weakest versions of arguments. And this is seen, we'll go back to Stephen Woodford. He's produced a video on critiquing the ontological argument. And the thing that he critiques, the version he critiques, is Anselm's version. But there's been a lot of progress since Anselm. There's been a lot of different versions that have been offered. One of the most recent ones is from Yuji Nagasawa, who's got this argument, this ontological argument that is it seems like it should have been proposed a long time ago because it just seems so obvious. But he sort of developed this new version of the ontological argument that, it's a lot different than the previous versions. But the point is that, if you want to really seriously critique an argument for the existence of God, don't just stop with like the weakest version, the easiest one to reject, the easiest one that you can find the biggest amount of flaws in this argument. You've got to also do the research and go and find what, okay, so that version may not be very good, but have any other philosophers, any other theists developed this argument further, responded to those objections? Have they, it's not just the different versions, it's also the responses to the objections. A lot of these responses, even to Pascal's wager, like the most common responses to Pascal's wager, like the many gods objection, have been responded to in the literature by like a number of different theists, a number of different people, including Liz Jackson, who's been on the channel a bunch and even had a dialogue with Alex O'Connor, Cosmic Skeptic, on that. So it's not just that they attack the weakest versions, it's that they're not really dealing with responses to these objections. I think that that's a really big problem. So do you have any thoughts on that before we move to your number 2?
No, that's really similar to something that I actually wanted to include on my list. And it was treating arguments, I don't know, a family of arguments as one argument, right? So you get like...
So I might just pause it there before Joe continues, because he's going to make a slightly different point. Cameron's point there that people don't always respond to the strongest form of an argument. Now, again, there's certainly some truth to this. You don't want a straw man, and you do want to focus on the best defenses of a position. I absolutely agree with that. However, there's also the fact that you need to be able to have a discussion at the level that people are at, or at least you begin there and you hopefully try to move them at a high level, which is what I try to do, right? So if people are engaging in the discourse at a particular level, then you need to engage with those concerns, even if they're kind of not the strongest form of the argument. And actually, I'll sort of admit to some fault here on my part, because there was a recent video where I was critical of Trinity Radio for Braxton for responding to YouTube comments. And he sort of pointed out in his response to me that, well, these are the comments that I get, and so I'm going to respond to them. And, I think, okay, that's fair enough. Although I still think that my criticism had some validity, because, there's always a question of which comments have been selected, and YouTube comments are particularly sort of low bar on average. But broadly, I think that was unfair of me, because, yeah, if you're engaged in a particular space of discourse, then it's fair enough to respond to things that are raised, in that space. So just because there have been stronger forms, often that's subjective, but it's not entirely, that there are stronger forms of an argument raised in the academic literature, it doesn't mean that you can't talk about other forms that people still hold or still believe in. So someone in the comments that I just showed before pointed out that a lot of this comes across as really gatekeeping, and I really don't like gatekeeping. It's a form of elitism, which I really dislike. And the reason for that, I think, is because I think of science and philosophy and critical thinking as being ways to expand our minds, expand our horizons, expand our thinking capabilities, and I mean, like as individuals, as a community, as humanity. And so that's what it should be for. So we should be calling for people to do better, right? To think more critically and to, refer to the best literature and so forth. But at the same time, we shouldn't be doing that in a way that's pushing people out. It should be bringing people in and encouraging them, not saying, no, you have to read all of these and become a philosophy professor and, read all these journal articles and only respond to that. And if you're not willing to do that, then you can't talk about this. I think that's ridiculous. People can talk about whatever they like and respond to whatever argument they like. The only issue comes about is if they're presenting what they're saying as like the strongest form of the argument, and then they knock that down. That's straw manning, right? So people shouldn't straw man. But if atheists do make a certain argument, it's fine for theists to respond to that, even if it's not the best form of atheism. Vice versa, if Christians make an argument, it's fine for atheists to respond to that, even if it's not the strongest form of Christianity or the defense of that argument. And because most people aren't on the cutting edge level of the literature debates anyway, even most philosophers, by the way, because most philosophers don't specialize in philosophy of religion, it doesn't matter. I mean, yes, we should be trying to, for those of us who are more informed, and although I'm not an expert in philosophy of religion, but I do think I certainly know more than the average person, I think it is important for us to try to, and people like Joe and Cameron, to try to help expose other people and try to bring up the level of discussion. That's good. But that's not the feeling I'm getting here. The feeling I'm getting is not trying to bring people in, but trying to push people out. And I really dislike that, because that's using philosophy as it's basically as a stick to hit people with, saying, no, you don't know what you're talking about, shut up. And I can't stand that, right? So I get really strong vibes of that throughout the talk, and that's, I think, throughout this video, sorry, and I think that's one of the reasons I dislike it so much.
Videos on the ontological argument, and it's like, I'm gonna prove that it's wrong, and the cosmological argument, and all these other sorts of things. It's like, no, there's no such thing. I'm sorry to say, break it to you guys, but there's no such thing as the ontological argument, the cosmological argument. It's a family of arguments. Like in ontological arguments, right? You got like a Madolian ontological, Gödelian, you got Anselmi. Anselm had like 2 or 3, and some people, you got a modal ontological, you got like symmetry break, like all sorts of stuff. And then in the cosmological side, you got like modal arguments from beginnings, you got like modal arguments from contingent, you got first cause type arguments, both hierarchically and linearly in the past. Like you got all sorts of different arguments, and it's like, no, it's like you'll see a video by someone, and it'll be like,
almost no one knows what Joel was just talking about there. I knew Joel was wrong. Like Joe, sorry. Almost no one knows what Joe was just talking about there. In terms of those different types of ontological aims, like the Gödelian and the Anselmian and the modal and all those other forms. I know a bit about that because I was doing some reading about ontological arguments for the response video we did to Cameron's 150 whatever arguments for Christianity. So I was reading up a bit on those. Ordinarily, I don't give much time to ontological arguments because they're very silly. But don't tell Joe I said that. But the point is, the reason I mention this is because like ordinary human beings don't care about the ontological argument because ordinary human beings mostly don't care about theology or philosophy of religion at all. And I think that, they should care more than they do. But the ontological argument is so far removed from the way that ordinary people think about things and can understand and actually interact with, the world. And that's why it's such a bad piece of natural theology. I think it's just pointless. It's a form of intellectual, over-intellectualizing at its worst, I think, even if it can be interesting to think about. And so the point is that not only is the ontological argument so far removed from what ordinary people care about or can understand or have any interest in, but then he's talking about all these other variations of it. And I'm just like, again, the point of all this stuff should be to elucidate these important questions, not to make it more complicated and confusing for no real purpose. It's not like the ontological argument settled anything. So it's a really strange way to go, basically, when you're talking about this discussion. It's like, no, you don't have to care about the Gödelian ontological argument. Like, it's not a good argument anyway. But anyway, he hasn't quite finished his thought there. So I just wanted to react to that choice of an example as sort of illustrating what I was saying. But let's finish his thought there.
The cosmological argument commits a composition fallacy, and it's just like, I'm pain, it's just like, it causes pain, and it's unfortunate. And again, like you said, this is worth emphasizing that it's on both sides. Unfortunately, some people will take the problem of evil and be like, hey, this atheist just stubbed his toe, and he's going to say, therefore, no God. It's like,
so this is a good question. Do I think it's fair for other experts like scientists to engage in gatekeeping derogatory statements? I'm not sure what derogatory means because I'm not really talking about people being derogatory. But the question is, should scientists gatekeep people who don't know from engaging in a discussion, let's say about climate change? Should scientists gatekeep for people who don't know what they're talking about? Well, it depends what you mean by gatekeep, right? If people are making confident claims that they know what they're talking about when they don't, well, then other people who are experts should say, hey, actually, that's not correct. But that's consistent with what I've been saying, right? I think that, so that is what philosophers should do is say, hey, look, there are these arguments that theists make or atheists make or whoever, and here are the problems with them. Let's, instead of having the discussion at that level, let's have it at this level, right? And try to pull people up. Science is a bit different to that because there are actually sort of generally accepted findings in science in the way that there often aren't in philosophy. Although, there are some in philosophy. They're just sort of methodologies that are taken for granted and so forth. And in that sense, like if someone is using as an example of that, if someone's going around saying that using the words validity and soundness incorrectly, for example, when they talk about arguments, then, you should just correct them, right? Because they're just sort of wrong about that. But for a lot of things in philosophy, it's more just a question of, like how persuasive do you find the premises and what sort of approach you're taking to, you can't really see what I'm saying. What sort of approach are you taking to think about that? And in that sense, I think it's much more helpful not just to try to shut people out, to gatekeep, but rather to just try to have the conversation at the level they're able to. And I think that science is similar there. Many people don't have the ability to understand climate simulations. It's not something I know that much about, right? They're very complicated. And so if people are interested in climate change, it shouldn't just be a matter of, unless you can, read the papers on the recent simulations and so forth, then we don't care about what you have to say. We're not interested in talking to you. No, it should be a matter of, okay, let's talk about this at the level you understand from the perspective of, expertise. I'm not saying expertise doesn't matter, but at the same time, there's a way to use that expertise and to convey the findings that exist and what is known in a positive way that tries to invite people to have the discussion at an appropriate level for them, rather than push them out. So, it's kind of context specific. In the sense that if people are confidently peddling nonsense, then that should be pushed back against. But that's not exactly what I'm talking about. Again, if people are confidently peddling nonsense in the philosophy domain, that should be pushed back against as well. But I think that is quite different from the fact, so religion is a very personal thing. It's a thing that you really have to have dialogue and discussion about. And I think gatekeeping people out of that is really not helpful. And I would say the same thing about science, although I think that the context is a bit different there. So I have a podcast called the Science of Everything podcast where I talk about science topics, and I really try to make things accessible and try to explain them clearly. And I think that's important because, again, I think that it's something that lots of people can be interested in. And I don't like the idea that, oh, no, these things are too complicated. We can't try to explain them to, sort of ordinary people. You just have to either, go to university for several years or just sort of forget about it. I mean, scientists don't normally say that, but that can be the attitude, right? And I don't think that's good. So I basically think that across domains, that's the case, that gatekeeping like that is bad. There is a place for expertise as well, but that needs to be done cautiously. And especially when you're talking about dialogue with respect to like religion and worldviews, then there's an added element of discursiveness that's always going to have to be there because it's sort of a personal thing. And so I think especially there, then the gatekeeping is particularly bad. But anyway, so that was a good question. I appreciate that. There's obviously there's some nuance to be had, but yeah, I stand by the what I'm saying there. So I accidentally unshared that, which I didn't want to do. So hopefully that's fixed that. Okay, so just to sort of set the stage where we are. So Joe is now talking about the idea that atheists talk about arguments. Sorry, they talk about families of arguments as if they're a single argument. So that's what he's getting at here.
Let's be a little bit more charitable, guys.
Yeah, that was the example I was going to give, is that a lot of theists will give a really weak version of the problem of evil and then respond to that. But we need to be responding as theists to the best versions of it. So like from his name is slipping my mind. I've got it. Tooley. Michael Tooley. Like he's got a debate book with Alvin Plantinga, and it's actually really, really good. You should go and read that. It's called Knowledge of God. But like he's got one of the most formidable arguments of problem of evil. And William Rowe and Paul Draper. There's a lot of
my boy.
Your boy. He's got one of the best versions of the problem of evil. And that's the kind of stuff that we need to be dealing with. Is not just these surface level expositions of it. So it definitely happens on both sides. But in terms of YouTube atheism, I think that I see that consistently and constantly in these videos that get put out by some of the top atheists. So all right, let's move on to what is your number 2?
So one of the reasons for this is because atheists, like particularly YouTube atheists, particularly the new atheists, they respond to like what I might call lived religion, like religion as people actually practice it and think about it and talk about it. And almost no one reads Alvin Plantinga or Swinburne. William Lane Craig, a few more people read him, but few people read his academic stuff, right? So hardly any actual like religious people engage with it at this level. Obviously there are some, right? But think about it. So Cameron has what, 70K, 80K subs on his channel, which is a lot more than I have, right? But how many Christians are there even in the United States? Even if you just count the evangelicals, it's like, I don't know how many. It's probably about 1,000 times that number. And sure, I mean, there are others who buy books and watch programs and other things and listen to talk. So this is, Cameron doesn't exhaust apologetics by any means. But the point I'm making is that it's a tiny, tiny sliver, even of evangelical Christians, right? Most religious people, most Christians are not interested in this stuff. But there are a decent portion of Christians who at least talk about their faith or have sort of think about it in some capacity, but don't really engage with the philosophical level apologetic stuff. And most atheists interact with these people, or certainly have in the past before like YouTube became big and online dialogue sort of took off. So it's completely reasonable for atheists to respond to real lived Christianity as they find it in their community and in their life. Why is it, let me put it another way. Why is it that atheists only are allowed to respond to the Christianity of Alvin Plantinga and Richard Swinburne and William Lane Craig? Why can't they respond to the Christianity of, their uncle or their brother or their neighbor or their friend or fiance or whoever, right? Again, this is really strange to me. Like, again, you don't want to straw man. You don't want to say that, okay, so, my brother thinks this, therefore, like, this is sort of present that as if that is the argument or this is what all Christians think. That would be straw manning. But to put this up as this is something I've heard discussed, or this is an argument that I've heard made, here's what I think about that. That's perfectly legitimate. That's people engaging in the discourse, that's relevant to them and that they can understand. Again, it's perfectly acceptable to say, okay, well, here's a stronger form of that argument, and then let's see how that fares, and let's see where we can critique that. So it's perfectly fine for people to have the discourse at their level. It's also perfectly fine, I think, good to try to lift the level of the discourse to get people thinking about the stronger, the more rigorous forms of the argument. But it's the gatekeeping side of it that I don't like. It's fine for atheists to talk about weak forms of arguments of theism if they actually encounter those, as long as they're not presenting that as the strongest version or as like the definitive version or as the version that the academics are presenting. That would be straw manning, but it's not straw manning to argue against something that you actually encounter. And atheists are completely at their liberty to do that. Now, that's not I prefer to discourse and critique more at the level of people like Cameron or Braxton, or as well as scholars like William Lane Craig, who wrote a book about. That's what I'm interested in doing. So I don't deal with the like more ordinary, typical objection stuff. But that's just my preference. That's what I'm interested in doing, and I think I've got some ability to contribute to that. That doesn't mean that's what everyone has to do. And likewise, Cameron's choice about where to pitch his sort of apologetics, it doesn't mean everyone has to do it that way.
So my number two, hopefully not stealing yours, but I said scientism and the devaluation of philosophy. So on a lot of internet circles, new atheist circles and whatnot, you kind of have this view known as scientism and scientism. Well, there are different versions of scientism. You have stronger versions and weaker versions, but oftentimes they'll say something like, science is the only way that we can come to know things. Science is the only path to knowledge, the only reliable path, or the only good path, the only true path to knowledge. And there are about a trillion problems with that, but I guess I'll just touch on two. I guess it's kind of self-undermining in two ways, and most of your audience will know this, but it's self-undermining in two ways, right? So first, science itself couldn't possibly deliver the result that scientism is true, right? Like you can't look at pressure gauges.
All right, so hang on. So just before he gets off on this, so the second worst mistake that Joe thinks that internet atheists make is scientism, or saying science is the only way of knowing. Now, there's certainly more than a grain of truth here. I've criticized scientism, or what I've called naive. Actually, I've forgotten what I've called it. I've written some articles on this and given some talks about this in the past, where I think it's yeah, it is a problem, and this is exemplified in comments by well, maybe I'll keep names out just to avoid people getting unnecessarily upset about their people they may respect. But comments to the effect of, we don't need philosophy and it's all a waste of time completely, and we can just do away with it. I don't agree with that. I think that is mistaken and narrow-minded. So to the extent that that's what Joe's talking about, I agree. But that is not all what Joe's talking about. He takes it a lot further than that. So let's hear what Joe has to say about what the problem is with sort of scientism and where atheists go wrong about that. I'll just jump back a little bit.
Two ways, right? So first, science itself couldn't possibly deliver the result that scientism is true, right? Like you can't look at pressure gauges and be like, 47, like 47, what is it, like degrees, like, oh no, therefore scientists. It's like, no, you can't look at a pressure gauge, you can't look at a Geiger counter, you can't look at a proton NMR machine, like none of those will tell you that scientism is true. And so it couldn't possibly be the result or the deliverance of science, and so it couldn't possibly count as something you could know per scientism. And so that's kind of self-undermining. Generally, you should avoid views that, if true, entail that no one could possibly know them, or indeed perhaps even be justified in accepting them. So that's the first reason it's self-defeating. Second reason it's self-defeating is that.
All right, so one of the issues here is that Joe doesn't really define what he's objecting to here by scientism, because there's scientisms. That's what I call it. I call it crude positivism. I wrote an article called Critique of Crude Positivism, and I give some quotes in there of the sort of thing that I'm responding to. That view is sort of that science as understood basically as the natural sciences, the physical sciences, is the only tool we need to understand things, and we can sort of dispense completely with philosophy. There are people who've said that, like Neil deGrasse Tyson comes to mind as an example of someone who said essentially this. Yeah, so in the comment here, T-Jump's requirement that something needs empirical evidence, including future testable predictions, to be considered as scientism. Empirical evidence is not necessarily scientist, because you could just be an empiricist, which I am. But the future testable predictions part I would agree with, because that seems to rule out like pretty much all of history, right? Or like, I mean, it depends what you mean by potential predictions. Maybe you could define that in a very broad way where it worked. But I think that's going to be hard to. It's going to be hard to have any knowledge of singular past events with that criteria, I think. How do you test the Big Bang Theory on that basis? I mean, I guess you could say, well, testable predictions on the basis of like the percentage of the different the different elements in the early universe. So that was sort of a future prediction, but it wasn't. I mean, that evidence already existed. It wasn't something that happened in the future, just wasn't known at the time. So anyway, I guess it depends on how you define that, but I'm pretty skeptical about defining it that way. So there are bad forms of scientism, is what I'm saying. But coming back to what Joe was just talking about, the idea that, yes. So this sort of triggered me a bit, because he said the classic thing that people always say when they're critiquing any sort of form of scientism, or what I would describe as a sort of a naturalized epistemology, or a sort of science-friendly approach to philosophy, which is more, maybe you could call it a modest form of scientism, or a more moderate form of a positivism. But he said the thing that, well, you can't look in a test tube or look at a Geiger counter and find and determine that like scientism is true or whatever. And whenever someone says that, maybe this is unfair, but whenever someone says something like that, I sort of immediately just assume, again, this is probably unfair on my part, I just immediately assume they don't know anything about science. Now, I don't think that's true in Joe's case, right? I'm saying that this is maybe my triggering more than anything else, but it's just because science works nothing like that. Science doesn't operate by just sort of observing a phenomenon and then reading a finding off of that. That's completely wrong. Science works by, I mean, there's no single scientific method, right? But science works by a combination of theory and predictions, and then testing that against a wide range of different evidence, and then reinterpreting that data and adjusting the theory and considering in the light of other lines of evidence. It's very, very complicated, right? You don't just like read findings off a Geiger counter. I mean, yeah, you obviously gather experimental evidence, but the point is like, think about this, the standard model of particle physics, right? The standard model of quarks and electrons and so forth. no one read that off a Geiger counter or in a test tube, right? That was theorized and then tested in a very long series of experiments going back decades, right? This idea that if scientism were true, there would have to be some sort of straightforward empirical observation that we would just directly make from a test tube or Geiger counter or whatever that would verify it or that would provide evidence for it is completely silly. If scientism were true, then under scientism's lights, again, sort of unclear how we're defining it, but all there would have to be is some sort of scientific method of establishing that it was true. Now, what would that look like? Well, you could debate that, right? I think under very strong forms of scientism, it's implausible, but under more modest forms, it's quite plausible because you basically just have to have a scientific method for analyzing the scientific method, essentially. Like, well, how does science, arrive at, justified beliefs or something along those lines, or why does science work, or whatever you want to call it. And I mean, I personally would describe that as basically the project of naturalized epistemology, this project of essentially trying to naturalize the project of epistemology within the sort of empirical sciences, so psychology, cognitive science, computer science, and so forth. So this is a project that Quine talked about, and I think is quite interesting. Now, in a sense, that's a form of scientism because it's basically trying to naturalize specifically epistemology, but broadly speaking, you might want to naturalize all of knowledge within a broadly scientific rubric. I'm very sympathetic to that claim, but that it's not the same as saying that like the only thing we need is like just current physics and chemistry and biology. That's a very much stronger form of scientism, or like we can only believe things if they're experimentally proven or they make future predictions. I don't agree with that strong form of scientism, or like we could just completely do away with philosophy. No, I don't think that's correct either. But the idea that broadly speaking, these that philosophical reasoning should be subsumed and sort of merged with scientific thinking and provide a unified framework for thinking about the world. I mean, that's what I think, right? And so maybe call that a soft or moderate scientism, whatever. I don't personally like that label, but if you want to call it that, then fine. The point is that there's no contradiction there, because all I have to do is develop an account as to how you would validate that within the framework. And I think that there are plausible things we could say about that. You just like empirically investigate and theorize about how we do science and about how we reason. And you can validate that using that method or you don't, right? It's a testable prediction essentially. Do we arrive at science using this set of methods or no? Okay, well, we've got to tweak the theory and work out how it works, right? This very silly idea that you just read scientific findings directly off experimental results without theory, without back and forth, without accumulation of evidence across frames. Now, I mean, obviously Joe here is sort of simplifying to make a point, but I don't think that he can get away with that here, because it's sort of critical that the only reason I think his point seems plausible here is because he's, I think, at the very least presenting a very uncharitable view of what it would look like to try to naturalize the process of, say, science or the process of epistemology, to say that, well, if you believe in scientism, you'd have to believe that you can just determine that scientism is true by looking at a test tube or at a Geiger counter. Obviously, that's ridiculous. Therefore, scientism is ridiculous. But you don't have to hold to that at all. Like, just, again, take the project of naturalized epistemology. That might be one approach where you could have a modest form of scientism. So I really object to the way that Joe Schmidt's framing this here, and I don't think it's charitable at all. Now, are there some people who seem to defend a very crude form of scientism that should be objected? Well, yeah, I think there are. And I mentioned one name, and there's others that I've discussed before. I don't really go too much into names here, but the point is that one has to be cautious here. If you're saying, okay, there's some very bad forms of scientism that should be objected to, fine, I'm not going to disagree with that. But it appears here that he's just sort of, Joe's responding to all things that could be classed as scientism or any type of sort of naturalized epistemology or anything along those lines. He doesn't really make that distinction or acknowledge that that's even an issue. And I find that really problematic here because, again, the way he's objected to it, I think, is extremely crude. All right, let's keep going.
Listen, science rests on a whole host of presuppositions.
Oh, yeah.
That there's an external world, that there are other minds, that our senses are reliable, that our memory is reliable. None of these could even remotely be justified by the scientific method, because the scientific method presupposes those, right? Like, if you're collecting data, you have to assume that your memory is reliable, like that you wrote down a 5.2 and then a 5.3, and then when you go back to consult your data and run your analyses, you have to presuppose that your memory and your senses and whatnot are reliable. And so there cannot be a deliverance of science itself, and hence these things cannot be justified by science. And so if scientism is true, you cannot even know these sorts of things. You cannot even be justified in them. And I mean, that just obviously collapses the very foundations of science itself and pretty much all of our knowledge. It gives you a kind of radical skepticism. And I guess finally, scientism makes literally zero sense from an epistemological standpoint. So, I mean, we have all sorts of ways of knowing things that have nothing to do, that don't have much to do with the scientific method, like rational intuition. How do you know that 1 = 1?
There's so much that he goes on about here. There's a comment here that I probably should mention. Using the scientific method to analyze scientific method is blatantly question-begging. I don't think so. Although, I mean, I can't do justice to that question in this stream, because that's a whole question in epistemology, right? It's about the structure of knowledge. So, are you a foundationalist? Do you trace everything back down to like foundations that you take as being non-inferentially justified, or are you a coherentist? Do you think that it sort of fits in a sort of a web of beliefs that are sort of justified in a coherence relation, or you're an infinitist? Do you think that you can just keep giving reasons on and on? Or maybe you're a reliabilist. Do you think that it's knowledge is justified by reference to the causative process that brought it about if it's reliable? So any position I take there is going to be subject to refutation from people who don't agree with that. So all I want to say with respect to that, you can't analyze the scientific method using the scientific method, is I disagree with that. I think that there are non-problematic ways of using a method to interrogate the success of that method. And broadly, I would point to something like abduction. So it's like, well, we keep getting consistent results using this method across a wide variety of applications. What is the best explanation of this? I think that we can use abductive reasoning to say that the best explanation is that this method is, reliably tracking something or other. It's similar to how I would justify induction. It's similar to how I would justify belief in the external world. Not everyone's going to agree with that. So that's why I was preface this by saying, look, it depends on your epistemology. So that's all I really want to say about that, is that, no, I don't agree that the scientific method analyzing itself is blatantly question begging. I think it really depends on how you're going to structure epistemology, and there's a lot to be said there. Now, so hopefully it's kind of at least, well, maybe not clear where I'm coming from, but at least you sort of see the general approach. But I want to focus back on what Joe is saying here. So he's saying that science rests on a whole host of assumptions that you can't test. He mentioned actually, I want to play that back again because I want to make sure I remember everything. Reliability of memory was one.
Presuppose that your memory and your senses and whatnot are reliable. And so there cannot be a deliverance of science itself, and hence these things cannot be justified by science. And so
with senses and memory, there was a couple of others, wasn't there?
If true, until that no one could rest on a whole host of presuppositions that there's an external world, that there are other minds,
external world,
that
other
our
minds,
senses are reliable,
senses,
that our memory is reliable.
Memory.
None of these.
Okay, so I'm just trying to remember them all. So senses, memory, external world, other minds. Why do we need to assume that there are other minds? That one's particularly strange to me. Oh, bugger. Sorry. I just wanted to, I don't agree with that, but that abductive reasoning, consequentialism is the foundation. I don't agree. I don't think you need a foundation, but I'm just highlighting that as the approach I'm taking, and then wanting to put it to the side because I want to go on with what Joe's saying here. I show that because I think other people might have been thinking that, so I just want to clarify the approach I'm taking there. I'm not a foundationalist. Anyway, so Joe's talking about, I don't know why you need to assume other minds. So let's put that to the side because I have nothing to say about that. Do you need to assume the external world exists to do science? I actually talked about this in my most recent video, that God doesn't need science. Of course, you don't need to assume the external world exists, right? In fact, plenty of scientists aren't scientific realists, and plenty of philosophers as well. They don't think that science does tell us anything about like the true reality or whatever of the external world. They think that it's useful for producing predictions and descriptions that we deploy in our lives. But does it tell us about like the sort of ontological underpinning of the world? No, not according to scientific, to anti-realists or like instrumentalists. So they don't assume at all that the external world exists. We could all be brains in a vat for all that they knew. We're just sort of exploring the irregularities of the simulation. I'm not saying I agree. I'm a realist myself. All I'm saying is you don't need to assume that the external world exists to do science. That's complete nonsense. Even if you are a realist, again, I think that it's something you can test. You can test your theory against the predictions that it makes, against the empirical evidence that comes in, and then on the basis of repeated success, you can make an inference to the best explanation and say, well, I think that the best explanation for why this is working is that there's some sort of correspondence to the underlying reality of it, and then I think you can make a realist argument on that basis. So I don't think you need to assume the external world exists at all, regardless of whether you're a realist or an anti-realist. What about the reliability of memory and perception? You might think that that's a stronger argument. I think it is stronger than assuming that the external world exists, which I think is just patently absurd. But I still don't think it's true that you really need to assume that, not in any strong sense. Now, I suppose you might need to say, look, scientists use their memory and perceptions all the time. So if these were completely unreliable, they were just completely all over the place, we wouldn't be able to do science. Well, that's probably true. But if our perception was so unreliable that like literally we didn't know if we were just, tripping ice all the time or whatever, and it was like you're in one of those weird, Disney cartoons where the sky is, swirling around and people are just floating. It's one of the like most bizarre. If that was what perception was like, then probably we wouldn't be able to do science, but we wouldn't really be able to do much of anything, would we? We wouldn't be able to go to the fridge and, get a drink out. You wouldn't be able to go to work in the morning. So that seems like a kind of a silly argument against science, because it seems to say if that was the case, we wouldn't be able to do much of anything. You wouldn't probably be able to speculate about theology either. So, well, who cares about that? That's just not the situation we're in. The question is, how reliable is perception, and under what circumstances is it reliable? That's the interesting question. Not is it to any extent and in any sense reliable. And the issue there is then something that's testable, because you can test that scientifically. In what circumstances is perception and also memory, I would add, reliable? When is it not? What are the downsides? What can improve it? What are mechanisms we can use to overcome that? And so science makes use of perception and memory, yes, but only in the way that any human endeavor does. And think about this. In science, we don't just rely on people's word for it. If someone conducts an experiment and says, yeah, I got statistically significant results, and you say, oh, can you show that? Like, can you provide your results? Oh, no, I observed it myself. Just take my word for it. Don't worry, I remember all the p-values. They're all up here. I can just tell you them. We wouldn't accept that. You require that they document things. They write things down, that these things can be checked, right? Obviously, that is a process that does rely on memory, because, there's always a memory process there. Even if things are automated, there's human memory operating at some point in there. But the point is we adopt mechanisms that try to reduce the many problems that there are with reliance on those. That memory is fungible. People can have biases that affect the way they interpret evidence. And this is actually a big problem with like p-hacking and abusing statistics, or just, doing many tests, or file drawer effect of putting away evidence that you don't like. All sorts of problems in science that we try. Basically, we find more ways that by which humans are good at fooling ourselves, and we try to iteratively correct those more and more by improving the methods we use. That's how I see science is being particularly good at. The idea that we just need to assume without qualification that perception and memory are reliable, I think is ridiculous. All we need to take is a very minimal extent of reliability, which we probably need to do literally anything. And then from there, we just, move and see, well, what methods work? Let's test those. Let's have corrective feedback mechanisms. And we move from there. So I don't see why we should accept this. There's lots of very interesting cases in science. N-rays are an interesting example of this, where scientists just fooled each other for a long time, thinking that there was a phenomenon where there wasn't anything. It was just all, I'm not even exactly sure if it's understood. People thought they were finding something, but there was no phenomenon there. Another example of this is the I think the Gansfeld experiments. Basically, can't think of the word. The psychology that studies like extrasensory perception and so forth. Someone will tell me the word for it. There are some experiments that have been quite well controlled, large sample studies that have found statistically significant effects of extrasensory perception. And mainstream scientists don't take these seriously, right? But there's an interesting methodological question about how did they obtain these results? Because it appears that their methodology is quite good. And I think that these are actually, there's an article that I read at some point that says, that homeopathy is the control group of science. It's because homeopathy is another example where there can't be a phenomenon. It's impossible, according to all of our knowledge of the world, that there's like homeopathy does anything beyond placebo. But there are studies that show that, including quite well-controlled ones. So it's an interesting question as to how did they obtain those results? And that raises questions about the scientific method itself and where biases can creep in, right? So I'm giving these as examples to make the point that it's an ongoing effort to understand the limits of perception and memory and other issues with respect to human bias. It's not something that is simply assumed at the outset and then kind of as just an axiom that you never look at. I just don't accept that at all. And I don't know why Joe is advancing that as an assumption of science. I think it's only an assumption at the very most superficial level, in which case I just, like, everything has that assumption. So I don't see that as especially interesting. And even there, I think there are abductive arguments that can be made. But anyway, let's keep going.
These could even remotely be justified by the scientific method, because the scientific method presupposes those.
So I've disagreed with that.
You have to assume that your memory is reliable, like that you wrote down a 5.2 and then a 5.3, and then when you go back to consult your data and run your analyses, you have to presuppose that your memory and your senses and whatnot are reliable. And so those cannot be a deliverance of science itself, and hence these things cannot be justified by science. And so if scientism is true, you cannot even know these sorts of things. You cannot even be justified in them. And I mean, that just obviously collapses the very foundations of science itself and pretty much all of our knowledge. It gives you kind of radical skepticism.
I've talked in my previous video about the notion of foundations of science or science collapsing. It's interesting. It's almost exactly the same language that's used by the gentleman in that video. I forget their names. I think this is just nonsense. I don't think science has foundations in the sense that they seem to be talking about it. There's philosophical questions to be asked, and it's important that I think scientists need to learn more philosophy. So I'm not going down that road. But there's no accepted theory of exactly what science does or how it gives rise to knowledge. There's a lot of debate here, and the notion that there's particular foundations that it's relying on, that if you don't assume, then the whole thing falls down. You have to be skeptical. I don't think there's any reason to think that, or at least no good reason to think that. Gotta be careful. No good reason to think that.
And I guess finally, scientism makes literally zero sense from an epistemological standpoint. So, I mean, we have all sorts of ways of knowing things that have nothing to do, that don't have much to do with the scientific method, like rational intuition. How do you know that 1 = 1, or that nothing can be both red all over and green all over at the same time in the same respect? Like, no scientific experience. Like, oh, here's a red thing. This isn't green all over. Here's a green thing. Like, no, you don't do that. Instead, you could just see it. You can just see it through your mind's eye, as it were. Also, you have testimony, right? So,
he's going through so many things here. So, rational intuition that, what was it, 1 = 1, or that nothing can be both red all over and green all over in the same sense at the same time. Now, some of you may not be surprised to learn, but I'm an empiricist, right, in the Humean tradition, right? Now, I don't know exactly what Joe would say about his position there, but the appeal that he just made makes it sound like he is more of a rationalist. Now, maybe that's a bit unfair because most philosophers do believe in a priori knowledge, and maybe he was just giving some examples of that. I'm pretty suspicious of the notion of a priori knowledge, but that's a whole big discussion in itself. All I want to say here is that the idea that you like can't be a fairly radical empiricist, and that you just have to accept the idea of what did he say? Rational intuition, I think is how he described it, as this knowledge that comes. Well, he didn't really define what he meant by that, so I don't want to straw man exactly what he means. But I think that those statements like 1 = 1 and nothing could be both red all over and green all over at the same time in the same sense, I think those have empirical content to them. Now, there's a difference between, what does it go again? Epistemological empiricism and semantic empiricism. And so I think that I'm sort of making a semantic empirical... I'm referring to more semantic empiricism here when I talk about that. For those who don't know, don't worry, I'm just trying to clarify a little bit. But the point is, I think there's empirical content to those claims, right? And that means that it's not just outside the bounds of science. Like, what is number? Like, where do we get this idea from? Can you study that in terms of like evolutionarily, or can you study that developmentally or socially? Of course you can. You can study this, right? So now maybe he wants to say, yeah, but that's not the same thing as the rational intuition that I just have by looking in my mind's eye. Well, maybe he doesn't think of it as the same thing, but the question is, am I obliged to interpret it that way? Do I have to accept his description of how it's supposed to work, such that there's just these things that are inaccessible in principle to scientific methodology? I don't agree with that. I think that in principle, all of this is, in principle, I'm not saying it like we have it now, but in principle, all this is susceptible to scientific methodology, including where we get these ideas of number from, and like identity and properties and stuff like that. I haven't proved that. All I'm just saying is that I'm not obliged to accept it just because he's asserting it here. So what the issue I have is not that Joe can't have this view. I mean, plenty of philosophers do, that there's sort of a priori knowledge that we can have that's totally separate from any empirical findings, or that science would have nothing to say about. It's just my position that, the point I want to make is that I disagree with that, and I don't think it's fair for Joe to just sort of pretend that there aren't other views out there, like empiricist views, that would have something to say about how there's sort of empirical content to those rational intuitions or judgments that he makes, and how that those could potentially be subsumed under a scientific account of things. And since that's the whole argument that he's trying to make, I think that's kind of a problem, right? It's kind of like, scientism can't say anything about this, but then, well, what do empiricists say about this sort of stuff? Like, it's as if there's sort of no account to be given, and I just don't think that's fair.
Cameron, if you told me that, hey, my daughter was really happy today when she came home from school, like, I'm not gonna be like, oh, where's your scientific? It's like, no, like, I can still gain knowledge on the basis of your testimony. Testimony can provide some evidential weight in favor of views. And then finally, introspection, right? How do I know that I'm having a good...
Yeah, so testimony is an important source of knowledge, and it is relied on a lot in science. I think that they maybe talk a bit more about later, but I don't want to get into that now.
Time right now, because I feel it, right? That's how I know. And I don't have, that's not acquired by science or anything. So it's just epistemologically.
Wait, what did he say there?
That's how I know. And I don't have, that's not acquired by science or anything.
Oh, acquired by science.
It's just epistemologically dead. Like, it makes zero sense.
Yeah, so introspection is a source of knowledge. So this is why I wouldn't be a radical scientist, right? I mean, I think that you can... So I wouldn't endorse radical scientism. I've got to be careful how I phrase this. Sure, you can introspect in that I'm in pain, for example. That's something you can knowledge that you can discern introspectively, or I'm happy now. But again, from Hume, well, at least from Hume and many other philosophers have been very skeptical about the limits of introspection and intuitions. I'm extremely skeptical about those as a source of knowledge about much of anything, apart from the sort of things that I just mentioned. Do they play a role? Yes, they do play some role in philosophy. I'm not saying we should completely get rid of them, but there are very important, significant criticisms to be made about the limits of intuition and introspection, especially when we're trying to answer philosophical questions. That's one of my pet bugbears, is when someone like William Lane Craig says, it's just an obvious metaphysical principle that everything that begins to exist has a cause. And he's got that through introspection, right? He just thinks that it's obvious, and so we should just accept that. Now, I'm not saying Joe's saying that, right? But I think this is where that sort of reasoning gets you, or it can get you at least. If you're not really cautious and you don't have sort of skeptical strings pulling back on you, like, well, how do you actually know that? Like, how have you established that? So again, Joe can have his view, and that can be different to mine. That's fine. Many philosophers are a lot more, think that it's valid to talk about, rational and pre-theoretic, pre-empirical ideas. That's fine. But when you're trying to critique a view like scientism, and you haven't defined it very clearly, it's important, I think, to not just present it as if, there's no options on the table for someone who's a more radical empiricist, or who is skeptical about a priori knowledge, or skeptical about intuitions, and who thinks you might be able to have a naturalized approach to science or to epistemology and things like that. It's as if these things, or these conversations, don't even exist in philosophy. And that's what I really object to here, that you can't just sort of present it as if there's no discussion to be had, or that there's no views, no options on the table for them, as Joe seems to have presented here.
You open up any epistemology textbook and you will see that this is just so wrong. Anyway, I'm done.
Yeah, no, that's you actually did steal my second one. So this is actually good. So we got the same one for number 2. And my number 2, the way that I framed it, was just bad epistemology. So you talked about scientism. The 2 that I had to talk about was local skepticism and extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, which depending on what you mean by that, it is actually true. And I'll talk about that in a second. But let's talk about local skepticism versus global skepticism. So I did a stream, again, with Liz Jackson, which you guys should definitely go check out. We talked about the difference between local skepticism in the domain of, say, religion, as opposed to global skepticism, which is what skeptics back in the day, like philosophical skeptics, were really after. Was like Descartes back in the day. He was like, I want to be skeptical of everything I can be skeptical of, and then start from like my most basic foundational point, and then go from there and try to build up my knowledge base from what I know that I know. And so that was basically the sort of the right way to go about it, at least in his mind back in the day. But the difference between, I think, what happens online today with skeptics is that they'll be super hyper skeptical with respect to one domain, say religion. So they'll be super skeptical of any kind of testimony from, say, the Bible or anything else. And they won't allow any kind of evidence in this one domain. But then when you move to a different domain, say just in your everyday life, when you give the example of, like, if I told you that my daughter was happy when she came home from school, like, you wouldn't necessarily, you probably wouldn't be skeptical of that, even though I just told you, on the basis of testimony, that's the only evidence available to you, is just through testimony. You'd be like, okay, that's pretty good evidence for this claim, And so I think that's really important to point out, is that there's one of the biggest mistakes is kind of applying their skepticism inconsistently. So there's a kind of local skepticism that's a big problem. So it's actually okay, I think, to be a skeptic, but what you need to do is be consistent. So if you are just hyper skeptical with respect to the domain of religion, then just apply that same level of skepticism to your other beliefs and kind of just see where you end up. So you may end up, a lot of philosophers have actually argued this, is that you're going to end up having to be skeptical of a lot, including pretty much all of your scientific knowledge. You think you know about science, because let's be honest, most of the people that are watching this, you're not a scientist. You don't actually go.
Sorry, I'm going to wait till he's finished, but I mean, I wanted to agree with him there, but because I agree, yes, we shouldn't be selectively skeptical. We should be consistent this is what I say, we should apply consistent epistemic standards across knowledge, across what our topics of investigation, and see where that leads. And I think there are atheists who are locally or disproportionately skeptical with respect to just claims about religion or the supernatural, and I don't think that is justified. However, there is a question, well, how skeptical are you going to be about, say, supernatural or religious claims compared to other sorts of claims? There's a sort of a prior probability or base rate type of argument to be had about that. But the other thing is that, so, okay, sure, I'm broadly fine with that. Yes, we need to be consistent in our skepticism, and people can go wrong there. I also agree with Cameron when he says that, well, then you're going to end up being skeptical about quite a lot of things. And I think, yes, we should be. I'm a real big fan of skepticism, not like global skepticism, but I think many people are too credulous about all sorts of things, including in science, right? In general, we should be quite skeptical about lots of things. So now, where it goes wrong is when Cameron here is saying, well, then you're going to end up being skeptical about a lot of science, or I think he said disbelieving a lot of science. Let me make sure I don't straw man him. What exactly did he say? Because being skeptical is good, but
so you may end up, a lot of philosophers have actually argued this, is that you're going to end up having to be skeptical of a lot, including pretty much all of your scientific knowledge. You think you know about science, because let's be honest.
Yeah, so he said being skeptical about pretty much all of your scientific knowledge that you think you know about science. So that implies a stronger form of skepticism, right? So in general, most published scientific papers are, I think, not very good. And I think even a lot of scientists in those fields are not as skeptical about results as they should be. I'm often quite cynical when I'm reading through papers. I'm like, I don't believe this, I don't believe that. I mean, that can go too far as well. But the point is, most methods don't work out. There's always problems. There's always variables you need to control for. And it's actually hard to get reliable knowledge. And there's so many cases throughout human history, people thinking they've figured something out when actually they haven't. And the comparative number of cases of people who should have been more confident, I think, is much, much smaller. But that being said, the idea that we actually don't know anything about science, or we're going to have to give up most, if not all, of our scientific beliefs that we think we have, which appears to be what Cameron's saying here, because he said that things that you think you know about science. I don't see how that follows, right? Because, I mean, the point is that there's levels of evidence, right? Some scientific claims are not well evidenced. Some are moderately well evidenced. Some are very well evidenced. So it just depends on the scale, right? I'm happy to say that there are some less well evidenced scientific claims. There's a lot in evolutionary psychology, just to pick one example that is sort of topical. that I think are not well evidenced. I'm not saying the whole field's bunk. I'm just saying that there's claims that you hear around that are not necessarily that well evidenced. There's plenty in other fields as well. String theory and physics would be another interesting one that gets talked about a lot, but is not well evidenced or really evidenced at all. And there should be more skepticism about some of these things. But then to go and to say, well, like pretty much all of the things that you think you know about science, you're probably going to have to dispense with, and that seems to be what he's implying here. I just don't see that at all, because it's just a question of how well evidenced is it.
Most of the people that are watching this, you're not a scientist. You don't actually go out and perform the experiments. And if you are a scientist, you're probably a scientist with respect to one little tiny microcosm of science. So you may do experiments in, say, microbiology or something related to like genetic mutation or something like that, but you're not an expert in tectonic plates or something completely outside of your field. And so you're going to be relying, no matter who you are, even if you're a scientist, you're going to be relying on testimony for the vast majority of your scientific knowledge. And so if you apply your the same level of skepticism that you apply in the domain of religion, I'm trying to talk too fast today. If you apply the same level of skepticism in the domain that you apply in the domain of religion to other domains, then you may end up with almost zero knowledge of anything. And a lot of people say that that's like a bad consequence of skepticism. So it's kind of like a Morian shift type argument. It's like that implies too much skepticism. I know that I've got two hands. I know that I have, I know that evolution is true. A lot of people think that that's true. So if you're a skeptic and you think that you know that common descent is a real thing, ask yourself, like, how do I actually know that? Is it because I've performed some kind of experiment? No, I probably read it in like a textbook. And you're basing that on the testimony of other scientists. So yeah, selective skepticism or local skepticism, I think that's a big problem. The other one was extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, but
somehow I failed to pause it there. Okay, local skepticism is a problem. Yes, I agree. We need consistent epistemic standards. I agree with that. But this idea that and so he was explicit there, you're going to end up with pretty much no scientific knowledge. I don't agree that we accept scientific findings on the basis of testimony of scientists. Maybe if you use the word expertise, I would be more happy with that. But I do think that is importantly different from testimony. And see, the reason I think they use the word testimony is because that's what we have with respect to the Gospels, right? They like to talk about gospel testimony and eyewitness testimony. If that's what they mean, like if that's the sort of category that they're trying to put that in, then they're completely disanalogous, I think. Well, other than a very trivial sense that like they rely on people saying stuff. Well, yes, but not any case of someone saying a thing is equivalent epistemically to another case of someone saying a thing, right? So in a very loose sense, yes, we need to trust the testimony of scientists, but only in the very superficial sense. What Cameron here seems to be ignoring, and I would say Joe before as well, is the whole set of institutions and practices that have been adopted and developed in science over hundreds of years to avoid the standard problems of testimony, of bias, of issues with memory, and of confounding variables, of all of these problems, right? We have so many methods for dealing with this now, and they're still highly imperfect, right? But the point is that we've adopted them to try to solve some of these issues, and the process is ideal at least. So self-improving and iterative, and we get better at doing this. So I don't just pick up a science book and say, oh, well, this person testifies to me that they believe, in common descent, so I believe it. No, I'm reading this and I say, well, they are claiming on the basis of many, many experiments and empirical observations and theoretical constructions and so forth that this is the case. Now, I do have to trust that what they are saying about the field is correct, but I can check that by looking at other sources, right? Or talking to other people, which you should always do. You should never just rely on one source for anything. And so this is not an issue of just single people testifying to this. This is many, many people who have reported very specific experiences with doing this experiment or testing that empirical observation or doing this theoretical work or this computational model and publishing that and making what they've done transparent. Again, ideally, it doesn't always work as well as we would like, but this is the general model. And then people check that, there's peer review, and people try other models and they test things. And we're talking thousands of papers and different insights and approaches over many, many years for something to become well-established scientifically. This is just completely disanalogous in anything but the most trivial sense to someone who reports seeing something funny in the sky, or even seeing someone after they died, right? And it happens once, and it's not written down to a long time later, and there's no ability to control, there's no cross-checks, there's no theory tests that we can do about it. Like, none of the usual cross-checks that you could do in science are possible. So I don't accept this equivocation of testimony. Now, I want to be fair, Cameron hasn't made an explicit link between like eyewitness testimony of the Gospels or whatever and science testimony of scientists. So if he doesn't support that, then that's fine. But I'm suspecting that, and I have heard other people make this claim. So I'm sort of this is the reason that I'm pushing back against this use of the term testimony, is because I feel like that it's sort of equivocating between a very loose sense in which we rely on the testimony of scientists, but with like all of these checks in place, and in the other case of when we rely on testimony of claims that have no checks in place, and that there should be an equivocation in the idea that there's an equivalent epistemic status that those have. And I just completely reject that. The epistemic status of testimony is entirely dependent on well, the credibility of the witness, sure, but also a whole host of other checks and balances and factors surrounding it that can't, like, you just don't get by just saying, oh, it was testimony. So I don't think that there's a relevant similarity there epistemically. So I just reject the idea that we're going to have to be equally as critical about, like, and skeptical about all scientific findings if we're skeptical about religion or religious testimony claims as we would about being skeptical about religion as we would for science. I think that is a complete mischaracterization and involves just a really crude use of the similar terms like testimony or relying on memory or things like that, when the whole structure of what the epistemic standard actually appeals to is just ignored.
But do you have any thoughts on what I just said about skepticism?
Just a quick thought. I mean, even when someone is an expert scientist in one area, like your experiment, there's pretty much no such thing as, like, again, there's some counterexamples, but there's pretty much no such thing as a lone wolf scientist. You have teams, right? You have teams, you have your lab, and oftentimes you'll have student assistants, and you have your entire team when you work on a paper and whatnot. And that itself, even the process of one experiment, even one day at the lab, right? You're relying on a whole host of testimonial evidence. You have your assistant go and make the dilutions of the solution and whatnot, and you say, did you dilute this by a factor of 10? They're going to be like, yep, I performed the calculations and I did it. You're trusting their testimony and whatnot, and perhaps also, your past experience with this person and so on. But still, even in the case of one scientific experiment, you are relying on all these different, ordinary methods like common sense and testimony and memory and all these other sorts of things. So,
sorry, again, I sometimes think they're finished, but then they keep going. So that's why the pauses don't always work out. Again, I just reject that. In the crudest sense, yes, obviously you do have to rely on testimony and memory, but only in a very sort of superficial sense, not in a sense that I don't think does the work that Joe wants it to there. So let's think about this. Let's take that example. Suppose I'm in a lab and we're making up solutions to prepare a buffer for something or other, right? And I ask someone, did you dilute that correctly? And they say, yeah, I think I did, yeah. Now, of course, that happens, right? But already that's bad scientific practice, because you should have a protocol which you follow carefully. Of course, that doesn't always work out that way. Anyone who's done science knows it's not always as good as it should be. But let's talk about idealized case here, and because that's sort of important, as you'll see what I mean in a moment. You should have a protocol where everything should be written down, or you should write it down as you do it. So there should be minimal reliance on memory. Why? Because we know that memory is often unreliable, especially when you're doing complicated steps, right? You want to minimize that reliance on memory. So you rely more on short-term than long-term memory, where immediately as you do something, you write it down or you tick it off the list or whatever, right? That's because that's a scientific practice that's been adopted. At least it's good practice. It's not always done, but it's a good practice that you should adopt so that you can remember what you did. Precisely because memory is often not reliable, not sufficiently reliable to do these sorts of things. You may remember that you mixed them, but was it 10 to 1, 100 to 1, or did I do that for all three of them, or the fourth one as well? Like you can easily forget things like that if you don't write it down. So there's an example of just missing the context of a practice like that. But now let's also expand that thought experiment, and let's suppose that there's one lab that's been doing these experiments and getting these wacky results that are really surprising and are contrary to theory, and other labs have tried to replicate them but failed. Now, what do? Do we just say, well, we have to trust the testimony of the people from this lab, right? I mean, they got the results, so it must be true. Do we just rely on this foundation that Joe seems to say that we have of trusting testimony? No, of course we don't. And I'm not even talking about fraud here, although that does happen sometimes. Even if we put fraud to the side, we don't just trust that. We say, well, okay, there must be something odd here. Either they're not reporting their protocol correctly, or we're not being able to replicate it correctly, or they're using a different reagent, or there's something about the cell line that they're using, or, there's a million things that could be different. But we don't just say, well, it must be, that they must have got valid results because they said that they did, and this is what they recorded. No, we dig into things and say, well, are they reporting this correctly? Did they do this exactly as they said? Is there some confound that we haven't picked up? And many times, like N-rays is an example that I just mentioned here, but there have been many other times in the history of science less spectacular than that, yeah, these sorts of things have found out that, results can only be found in a single lab or by a single experimenter. And when that comes out, usually they're just not trusted. It's like, well, we don't really know how they got these results, but they can't be replicated. We can't understand them. We can't construct a theory of them. So we're just going to write a question mark over that and sort of leave it for the time being. We might figure it out later. We don't just say, well, this must be the truth, and we're just sort of going to have to accept that. That's not how it works. It seems that what Joe is saying would imply that science would work completely differently. You would just trust any empirical observation as though it must be correct, because you've got to, as long as there's no fraud or anything, because you've got to rely on that testimony or memory and so forth. That just isn't how it is. I think it's an abductive approach where it's like, well, we know that there's many things that can go wrong in the process of collecting data or conducting experiments, and even in theorizing. This sometimes even happens with mathematical proofs. I remember there was one that came out, I don't remember what it was proving, and then there was found to be a mistake in it, and it was sort of corrected Someone point out, so this even happens in mathematics, right? Stuff like this. Someone points out Large Hadron Collider a few years ago. There was some loose cable that they found because there were some neutrinos going faster than the speed of light or something like that. That took a long time to track down. So these anomalies crop up, and we can, scientists apply, I think, broadly speaking, an inference is the best explanation. They say, well, how can we account for this? Is it a legit result? Is it an artifact? Is it even fraud, which sometimes happens? What's going on here? And they sort of work it out iteratively. We don't have to just take these assumptions as foundational in the way that Joe is talking. And I just don't think that reflects the practice of science.
Yeah, I want to say one quick thing about memory. And I watched a video of this guy who has just like, I think one of the worst cases of short-term memory loss that's known to man. And I was watching this YouTube video about it. It's so sad. His short-term memory is so...
skip over this because
we did, Joe. Even by the end of it, nothing you could do to get out of just having to rely on it like you this world. And there's no amount of scientific experiment or data or whatever that you could use to try to justify that. You just got to rely on it without argument. And I think that that's really interesting to think about. Okay.
So only if you're a foundationalist, right? Or a particular type of foundationalist, do you just have to say, I'm just going to rely on this without any argument. I don't accept that myself. I'm not a foundationalist. I don't think that there are non-inferentially justified truths. Or if there are, I don't think that they're the sorts of like, you just have to trust your memory or something like that. So anyway, that's a further discussion. But they're talking about this as if this is just a fact. It's not just a fact. This is a contested view. So you can say, I don't think that works. And again, I don't think crude scientism works either, but they haven't really defined, they haven't been careful about what sort of scientism they're talking about. So I'm just sort of responding in a general form by saying, look, I think they're way overstating the case here, and that a form of more modest scientism, again, I don't like that label, but if they're going to call it that, I think it more is just a sort of a reductive naturalism, science-friendly philosophy with naturalized epistemology and scientific metaphysics, stuff like that. That's the sort of approach that I have. And these are arguments that could be levied against that view. That's fine. But they're not just saying these are some objections they have. They're saying these views are just obviously completely wrong, and you can't even hold them as a rational person. But not even acknowledging that these are debated, like empiricism and justification of scientific method, and you don't have to be a foundationalist and so forth. Yeah. Highly objectionable when what they're supposed to be doing is responding to like the biggest mistakes, not just like, here's some things I disagree with. Like, these are supposed to be just categorically mistakes. I don't think they are categorically mistakes. I think they're just different perspectives that need to be discussed.
The next one is extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Is that what it is? Yeah. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So the first thing that's wrong with that is that a lot of people, they don't really define what they mean by extraordinary. And so once you do that, I think that depending on the way that you define that and the way that it's sort of actually formalized, if you get clear on what you're saying, that's one of the things that philosophy tries to do, or at least analytic philosophy. I'll talk a little bit about analytic philosophy for a second. Good thing about analytic philosophy is that they try to get clear on like what someone is saying so that you can really analyze what they're saying and whether or not it's true. And so if you actually define your terms, I did a show with Tim McGrew, who's a sort of expert in logic and probability and everything. And we analyzed this claim, and we looked at one way to look at it as extraordinary. So basically what it breaks down to is if you define these terms in, I think, the way that they ought to be defined, then basically all you're going to be doing is ending up giving the sort of a Bayesian probability calculus. And so if you have a claim that has a sort of really low prior probability, which is, I think, the right way to interpret the first part of this claim is an extraordinary claim. I think that really just means a claim that has a really low prior probability. Then you need some good evidence in order to overcome or outweigh that initial improbability that you've got in the prior there. And so you've got to have some really good evidence to overcome it. But the mistake I think that happens with this is that the assumption here, and this is just based on our sort of, I think, natural intuitions about the world, is that, and I think it's also sort of propounded by like movies and TV shows and stuff, is that like you're expecting, in order to overcome some initial improbability, you're expecting to get like one piece of super good evidence. Like you want, in the case of someone who's being accused of murder, you want like, video evidence or DNA evidence or something like that in order to like say that this person is guilty. But in a lot of cases, you don't have just one big piece of evidence. You've got a whole bunch of small pieces of evidence that sort of all together end up overcoming the initial improbability that you started with on the first side of the equation. And so that's just a really important thing to keep in mind here, is that what one big piece of evidence can do, a whole bunch of small pieces of evidence can do the exact same thing. And you can see this very clearly once you actually do the calculations and probabilities theory. So that's one of the things that Tim pointed out, which I think is just really, really good. And that's a mistake I think a lot of atheists make, but also Christians too. And you can do that with the problem of evil too. Anyways, thoughts, Joe, and then we'll move to the top.
I don't have anything. I don't have anything to add on that. That was good. I mean, yeah, like you said, oftentimes, well, it depends on how you define extraordinary. And once you really kind of rigorously define it, I think it's just going to boil down to Bayes' theorem. And they're just pointing out that if you have a really low ratio of the priors, then your likelihood ratio is going to have to be pretty high to make up for that, which is like, okay, thanks for telling me a basic fact about probability theory. I appreciate it. Yeah.
And then you've got to actually do the work of pointing out that the prior probability actually is low, which is a sort of assumption that a lot of people make. And then you've also got to argue that the evidence doesn't overcome the prior, which is another thing that just doesn't sort of happen. So it's important to actually, like, instead of just relying on a slogan and saying that like, okay, claim victory and like all my work is done because I said this one thing. No, you haven't even really begun, because you got to define your terms. You've actually got to defend both sides of the equation, that you've got a low prior and that the evidence doesn't overcome the prior. And a lot of times that doesn't happen.
Well, okay, that's something that's pervasive in all this, right? This sort of sloganeering, which is on both sides, right?
They're on about sloganeering. That's another point. Okay, so extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So this is a claim that is pretty much, I mean, often deployed against the resurrection, and it is based on the thought of David Hume. I mean, I'm not saying it's the only person who's said something like that, but certainly he's said some. A lot of his comments, a lot of his thought was kind of directed against about that sort of thing. So there's a double whammy here. It's against the resurrection and it's from David Hume. So they really don't like extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. When I say that, I'm talking generally about like the internet apologists and so forth. So Cameron said, well, technically it's correct, but really what it means is that just, it's like Bayes' theorem, basically. The lower your prior, the higher the likelihood ratio you need to overcome that. Now, that's one interpretation of what it means to say extraordinary claims or extraordinary evidence. But I want to disagree already on the notion that you have to interpret the extraordinary claims mantra in probabilistic terms. I disagree with that. That's an assumption. It's hotly debated as to whether, or just like what role probability plays in scientific reasoning, or in reasoning generally. There's been a big trend recently towards like Bayesian epistemology, Bayesian approaches to science, scientific confirmation and so forth. But that's not the only approach. There have been other thinkers who think that our ways of thinking more generally don't always obey the probability calculus, that we need other axiomatizations that are different from standard probability theory. I think I don't have a firm view on this, but I'm sort of open-minded about this because it's sort of not, I mean, the standard probability theory has a lot of theoretical virtues, but there are objections people have, and there are points to be made about this. So what I want to say here is just that you don't have to interpret that in probabilistic terms. That is an interpretation of it. And I don't think it's the only way that you can deploy it. So the second point, though, is with respect to the fact that, okay, let's suppose we do interpret it in probabilistic terms. Is it kind of interesting? And Cameron and Joe are just kind of saying, well, it's a fairly trivial claim. It's just saying the lower your prior, the higher your likelihood ratio needs to be. And I've read philosophers say a similar point as well about sort of Hume's maxim here. But I think this is very unfair. First of all, there have been many surveys of, well, I'm thinking doctors, but of all sorts of practitioners, that ask them simple questions about, if I have a test that has a 5% false positive rate, and it tests for a disease, and let's say no false negative rate, and it tests for a disease that has a prevalence of 1 in 1,000, and I get 20 people, and or maybe it was 100 people, I can't remember the number, and test them all for that disease, what is the probability that one of these people actually has the disease? And a large proportion of the I just read this recently. It was like 70-something% of the doctors, I think, said, there's a reliability memory, I might have got that wrong, but it was certainly more than, it was a large majority, said that the probability that a tested person had the disease was 95%, because there's a 5% false positive rate. But that's completely wrong, because it ignores the base rate. In fact, it's, I can't remember, doing Bayesian calculations live, especially when you're making up the example on the fly, is not the best. So I can't remember what the probability is, but it's a lot lower than that, because you have to consider the low base rate. And the point here is that you might say, well, that's just trivial, right? It's just Bayes' theorem. But the point is, people are really bad with Bayes' theorem, even doctors, when this point has been made for decades now. And most people aren't even as qualified as doctors, probably even heard of Bayes' theorem. How many people have actually heard of Bayes' theorem? I'm sure most people here have. How many people who are theists or even engaged in these debates have heard of Bayes' theorem? Or even if you've heard of it, who know actually what it is? Not that many. I mean, I'm generally a fan of Bayesian reasoning, right? I think it's pretty cool. But to say that it's this notion of extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence is trivial because we all know Bayes' theorem is, I think, another example of gatekeeping. Even people who know it are not good at applying it in different cases. So it can be very important to bring people's attention to the fact that, for example, the base rate of resurrections is really low. And that doesn't depend on whether you're a theist or a naturalist or whatever. It's very low on any worldview, because there just haven't been very many of them. So in that sense, it's important to draw people's attention to this fact, because it's very easy to forget. Again, it's an issue of psychologically, we have a predisposition towards ignoring base rates in many contexts. And so this is one of the important points to bring our attention back to that fact. Now, you might say, well, it's just kind of a slogan. But I mean, I think it could be a helpful slogan. Sure, you might then need to explain it in the context, but I don't think there's anything wrong with the principle. And I think it's an important principle. And I think it's actually, in general, more helpful to say it that way than saying, if you have a low prior, your Bayes factor has to be much higher. Like, most people won't know what the heck you're talking about. But if you say extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, people generally get the idea of what you're saying, and then you apply that to the situation. So I don't I don't agree with this. I think that the principle doesn't have to be understood probabilistically, but even if you do, it's still a very important and profound principle. And even those of us who know it well are still need to be reminded of it in many cases because it's easy to ignore. So I don't accept these objections to it as being, again, the point is that this is one of the biggest mistakes atheists make. Well, yeah, maybe it's used as a slogan too much. I can accept that. But the idea that there's anything wrong with bringing it up or that it's just trivial, I disagree with that. I think it's a very important thing and it should be brought up quite often when we're talking about these discussions.
Right? You just have these one-liners that you think kind of just, settle things. It's like, no, let's roll up our sleeves. Let's really try to, like, I don't know, pursue the truth here, love one another while we're doing that, and, just stop with the slogans. So.
Stop with the slogans, please. Okay.
That's our slogan.
Our slogan is stop the slogans.
Now, I hope I'm not the only one. Why did I do that? I hope I'm not the only one who noticed the massive irony of Cameron complaining about slogans. But he does say more. I can't remember if it's now or a bit later. He does actually have something to say about that. So I won't comment on that until it comes up again. Oops.
Yes.
Okay. Someone said, where can I get your t-shirt? They're talking about yours.
Yeah, so I made this myself. I should probably try to sell these or something. But on the right sleeve, it's got the universal.
While they talk about the T-shirt with respect to this question,
quantifier, and then right here we've got.
I think Joe actually agrees with.
That's all. But
yeah, to be talking over them. I think Joe actually agrees with a lot of the stuff that Cameron is saying here, and probably just wants to stay on the main point. I mean, for example, Joe is the one who mentioned the sort of what I'm calling a form of the teleological argument as evidence for theism. I don't know exactly what his views are, but I don't know. I don't get the impression that he's holding back a lot here. But again, I don't like to psychologize too much. Just thought I'd answer that question. So let's move on.
I customize it on like a logo.
Yeah, we can.
By Lacktheism, by Lacktheism,
hang on.
Present this for a little while, but it's Lacktheism. Okay,
Lacktheism is his number one.
By Lacktheism, by Lacktheism, I mean.
I'm gonna put you full screen.
Okay, so by Lacktheism, what I mean by that is people defining atheism in some way or another as a lack of belief. Now, let's be clear, first of all, that we can define terms however we like. And I noticed right when you were going, no, it's all good. So let's be clear that we can define terms however we like, but also let's be clear that definitions really, really matter. So right now, I've got Michael Huemer, who's a great philosopher. This is his 2021 book, Knowledge, Reality, and Value. It's quite good. I just want to talk, he gives some really nice.
Hang on, what was the subtitle of that?
Let's be clear that we can define terms however we like, but also let's be clear that definitions really, really matter. So right now, I've got Michael Huemer,
a mostly common sense guide to philosophy.
One book, Knowledge, Reality, and Value.
I wonder what that means.
I just want to talk.
I'm generally skeptical of the value of common sense, but I mean, there's different meanings that could have. So I was just interested there. Oh, welcome, Nathan,
really
to the
nice
chat, by the way.
On the importance of definitions, because I can tell people, I can hear people right now, like, furiously typing, saying, I can define atheism however I want. Like, okay, yes, you can, but... Okay, so,
I don't actually think that's a good objection, by the way.
From Huemer. To correctly analyze the term, you have to give a set of conditions that correctly classifies objects in all possible circumstances. In assessing this, we appeal to linguistic intuitions. That is, if normal English speakers would, when fully informed, call something, let's say, knowledge, then your analysis should classify it as knowledge. If not, then not. And so...
It is appropriate to give reforming definitions of terms, though. But I mean, broadly, I'm on board with that. So let's just keep going.
He goes on to say, this might seem unimportant to you, right? Who cares about semantics? Why not just stipulate how you intend to use a word and forget about the standard English usage? Well, there are three reasons for not doing that. First, this causes confusion for other people who are familiar with the ordinary English use of the word. Second, ordinary usage usually serves important functions. Human beings over the millennia have found certain ways of grouping and distinguishing objects, that is, certain conceptual schemes, to be useful and interesting. These useful conceptual schemes are embodied in our language. Current usage reflects in a way the accumulated wisdom of many past generations. And finally, third, it is actually almost
not entirely sure what I think about the accumulated wisdom argument. I mean, there's something to be said about that, because past usage does indicate something about what people find useful to talk about. But, there's a lot of crap that's just accumulated in our language and everyday intuitions about things that's just rubbish. So, again, it's just useful to, I think it's useful to flag things like that where it sort of highlights potential differing perspectives that one's coming from. But anyway, I don't want to oversell that point.
Impossible to escape from the conceptual scheme that you've learned from your linguistic community. And he goes on to talk about the importance of that. But this is all to say that, yes, while you can define terms however you like, it's actually really, really, really important that we kind of get a correct definition. And there is a notion of correct and incorrect definitions. If I define knowledge as true belief, that's just incorrect. Knowledge is not true belief, because you can just make a guess and you could just happen to be right. And so you can have a true belief, but that obviously doesn't count as knowledge. So there are correct definitions and incorrect definitions. And I'm just going to try to point out that Lacktheism is probably an incorrect definition of atheism. So first I need to talk about what belief is. So by belief,
again, I don't really like the idea of correct or incorrect definitions for things like, for contested terms like atheism, although I'm quite happy to say there are better and worse definitions. Although I have a problem with the notion of definition as it stands, but I'll let him, he goes for quite a while about this, so I'm not sure exactly where the best places to pause will be, but I want him to keep, let me just say at this stage, the project of defining atheism and finding a correct definition, I'm not even on board with that necessarily, because I don't think a lot of terms have definitions. It depends how you define definition, ironically enough. I guess I might as well sort of start it now. So there's an idea that a definition is a set of necessary and sufficient conditions that clearly characterize what the thing refers to. And I think that most terms that we use actually don't have that a sort of clear set of necessary and sufficient conditions. So the classic example, which I think was Wittgenstein, someone will correct me if that's wrong, who gave the example of game, like gives a set of necessary and sufficient conditions for something to count as a game. Well, you can't, right? Because it's a very broad concept, and there's many different things that count as that. Like, what does chess have in common with football and tennis, and all the other things that count? So the notion that he talked about was family resemblance. I'm pretty sure this was Wittgenstein. Someone correct me if I'm getting the name wrong. Again, as I said before, I'm not very good with names. So yes, family resemblance, the idea that there's a sort of set of things in common and that some things are more sort of central and maybe some things more peripheral. This is the way I think about many concepts. Now, obviously, there are some concepts that do have precise definitions, like especially maths and so forth. But a lot of things, especially things like, atheism or Christian or whatever, they're going to be more of a family resemblance term. There's some people who are sort of more traditionally or like core to the notion of an atheist, or like paradigmatic prototypical cases, and more sort of peripheral cases, or it's less clear. It's more of a graded resemblance concept. Now, that's contested as well. I'm not saying Joe has to agree with that, but this is pretty important here. Like, he said the biggest mistake atheists make is using atheism to mean Lacktheism. And he's justifying that by giving the correct definition of atheism. And he's not even acknowledging that the fact that there's, I think strong arguments at the very least to reject the whole idea of giving it a definition in the way that he seems to think, which is like a fairly clear and precise set of necessary and sufficient conditions. I don't think that can be given for a lot of terms like this, including plausibly atheism. And so this is why I'm not even necessarily on board with the whole project that he's about to go on about, trying to define what the best definition of atheism is. That being said, let's see what he has to say about why Lacktheism is the wrong definition of atheism.
I mean, and philosophers mean, and most people mean, affirming some proposition or statement to be true, okay? That is taking it to accurately represent reality.
So that's what a belief
Philosophers
is.
call belief a kind of propositional attitude. It's like an attitude that you take toward a proposition. You affirm it to be true. So let's take a first analysis of atheism as Lacktheism. Okay, so this first analysis is going to say S, for someone S is an atheist if and only if S lacks a belief in God.
All right, now this is just a pet peeve of mine. It's nothing really on Joe, because this is standard. I just hate it when philosophers do this. They say, like, a proposition P is justified if P has so-and-so. They just introduce this notation when it's completely unnecessary. Just say a person is an atheist if they believe. You don't have to say a person A, or was it S or whatever, is an atheist when S has. I just don't understand why that's done. Like, sometimes it's useful, right? But they just seem to do it whenever I never get it. It's like, just talk like a normal person. Why do you, no one says, consider a butcher B. If B is in this, you just say a butcher is a person who, like, anyway. People who read a lot of philosophy will know what I'm talking about. It's something that annoys me. It feels like it's just kind of posturing when this is done unnecessarily. It's not. It has value, but I think it's overdone. Anyway, let's keep going.
Okay, so there are some counterexamples to this. So firstly, a subatomic particle, right, lacks a belief in God, but it's not an atheist, right? If you think subatomic particles are atheists, well, then you have to say that the number of atheists in existence is on the order of 10 to the power of 80, and that's a bit difficult for Pew surveys.
That's true.
Also, zygotes, fetuses, and babies, right? These are human beings that lack belief in God, but it seems implausible to call them atheists. Again, Pew surveys don't have to add 400,000 new atheists every day to their data. That's how many babies are born every day. And also, they don't have to consider how many eggs are being fertilized per day in order to estimate the number of new zygotes coming into existence. So we shouldn't define an atheist as something which lacks a belief in God. So let's move on to a second analysis that tries to...
All right, let's talk about this here, because I think this is a decent... I'm not really into giving definitions of atheists, but I think it's legitimate to use the term atheist to refer to anyone who lacks a belief in God. Obviously, I wouldn't say subatomic particles are atheists. That's kind of silly. But this idea of whether babies are atheists, this is an interesting question, because this is often brought up as a potential counterexample. And I never, ever hear this guy... I seem to be the only person who knows about this. Obviously, I'm not, right? It's just, I don't know why no one brings this up. And what am I talking about? I'm talking about this guy. Wait, let me share this. If people have heard me talk about this before, they may know where I'm going with this. Now, I've got to be careful here. I'm not saying this proves what I'm saying is correct, but I do think it's a relevant, at the very least, it's a relevant consideration when we talk about the baby point, right? So, okay, this gentleman, I'm just trying to zoom in a bit here, Baron de Holbach. He was a great philosopher and encyclopedist of the Enlightenment, and one of the first, not like the very first, but one of the earlier prominent avowed public atheists in Europe. He lived at a time where it was only just becoming acceptable to be. I mean, it wasn't exactly acceptable, but you could be an atheist without getting your head chopped off, at least. Sort of around the same time as Hume, right? Now, what did he say about this? So the point is, it doesn't mean this guy is right, of course. And maybe the usage has changed over time. But at the very least, the way this guy used the term atheist should be at least somewhat relevant in how we assess how we use the term atheist. Like it's at least, if this guy thought it was acceptable to use it one way, then at least it can't be totally crazy to use the term that way. At least I would say, at least it's something. Now, anyway, what did he say about this? So, I mean, this is from WikiQuote. I'm pretty sure this is reliable because I've read this in many other places. Okay, here it is. Obviously, this is translated from French, but he said, all children are born atheists. They have no idea of God. He thought, Baron de Holbach, one of the first prominent outspoken atheists in, at least, in modern times in Europe, thought that children count as atheists because he defined atheism basically as Lacktheism. Obviously, the word isn't here, right? But that's how he thought about it. Now, do we have to agree with him? No. But at the very least, I think you've got to say, well, some of the very earliest atheists, like this guy, thought that atheism applied to like children as well, or actually babies, because he says they're born atheists. So I don't think it's totally crazy to say that children are atheists, right? There's at least a question to be discussed there, I think, and no one seems to mention this point. I find it really strange that it's not even brought up. Okay, now. What else did I want to say about atheism? I think nothing at this point because I wanted to wait for... I've got some more to say, but let's let Joe go a bit further. But yeah, I mean, already I'm a bit unconvinced because I think that you can make a case that babies are atheists. Maybe I should have said by preface, I normally stay away from the Lacktheism discussion because I find it fairly boring, and I'm happy to just defend a robust... Wait, what? I'm fairly happy. Sorry, something confused me here. I'm fairly happy to just defend a robust, naturalism rejection of the existence of God. So I don't defend Lacktheism. I don't find it interesting. But when this is being presented as the single biggest mistake that atheists make, and as you'll see, that the justification that's given here, I think is really unsatisfactory, I feel the need to push back against it. So I don't think it's the most important question, but when it's presented as the biggest problem, then I think there's an issue here. So let's keep going here. Please tell me if I screwed up the sound again.
Avoid those counterexamples. This is what good analytic philosophy does. Oftentimes, you find counterexamples of something, but then you try to bolster it, right? You try to strengthen it and try to, defend it from those counterexamples that try to attack it. So here's the second.
In general, agree, but I'm going to talk about it here because of the context of the video.
Of forming beliefs, and yet lacks a belief.
Let's just
to bolster it, right? You try to strengthen it and try to, defend it from those counterexamples that try to attack it. So here's the second analysis. So S is an atheist if and only if S is capable of forming beliefs and yet lacks a belief in God. So we're getting better, right? Because the babies and the zygotes and whatnot are not capable, at least directly, of forming the kind of propositional belief.
Yeah, I forgot to mention, Christians were also called atheists by the Romans because they didn't believe in the, or they refused to, they didn't acknowledge the existence of and refused to sacrifice towards the traditional, Roman polytheistic gods and the emperors. So that's another early usage of the term that is quite different to how we use it. Now, we don't have to use the term the same way, but I just don't think it's crazy to consider these historical usages in informing how we use it now.
And neither are subatomic particles. So we get rid of those counterexamples. But there are still many problems. So consider someone who thinks that there is substantial evidence for God's existence and also substantial evidence against God's existence. So suppose, for instance, that they assign a 50% probability to the proposition God exists and a 50% probability to the proposition God does not exist. So is this person an atheist? Well, to me, it seems not. They literally think God's existence is as likely as God's non-existence. But okay, suppose you think that such a person is an atheist, okay? There are still three problems that I think remain for this particular analysis. First, it collapses the distinction between agnostic and atheist. I mean, just think about it. Like, what could possibly count as an agnostic under this definition? I mean, for anyone capable of forming beliefs, they either believe in God or they lack a belief in God. If the former, they count as a theist. But if the latter, then per this definition, they're automatically an atheist. There's simply no room for agnostics on this picture. They just don't fit in. And that shows that the definition is faulty, since any carving up of the conceptual space needs to accommodate a distinctly agnostic position. The second problem for this, or the second further problem for this.
All right, let's talk about agnosticism. And here I'm going to stop sharing again and share this article, which I'm pretty sure Joel actually, sorry, I'm calling him Joel. Joe refers to, apologies. I suck at names. It's like my Achilles heel. I just screw up names all the time. What am I wanting to share? I'm pretty sure Joe appeals to this very article, which is interesting because I don't think it supports his position. Atheism and agnosticism, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. For those interested, this is written by, oh, what happened there? Written by Paul Draper. So decent source there. Now, I don't agree with everything he says with respect to these definitions of atheism. But I'm going to skip over that for the moment because I want to talk about definitions of agnosticism. Because the way that Joe just presented agnosticism, I think, is completely wrong and reflects a very common misusage, which is interesting because Joe is really concerned about how atheists are defining atheism as Lacktheism. But he just gives this, I think, very silly and incorrect definition of agnosticism. So let's have a look at this. The terms agnostic and agnosticism were famously coined, so a specific person invented these, in the late 19th century by English biologist T.H. Huxley. And he wanted to use those terms to refer to people who were ignorant of these matters and didn't want to make a claim and didn't think other people should be making these claims either. He did not, however, define agnosticism simply as a state of being agnostic. He used the term to refer to a normative epistemological principle, something similar to what we now know as evidentialism. So basically the idea is that it is wrong to say that one knows or believes that a proposition is true without having sufficient evidence for it. It was Huxley's application of this principle to theistic and atheistic belief that ultimately had the greatest influence on the meaning of the term. He argued that since neither of these beliefs is adequately supported by the evidence, we ought to suspend judgment on the issue of whether or not there is a God. Nowadays, the term agnostic is used to refer to those who follow the recommendation expressed in his conclusion. An agnostic person is a person who has entertained the proposition God exists but believes neither that it is true or that it is false. I'm just trying to see if there's anything else that I want to say here. So this is actually a psychological sense of the term, which is an important point that Draper makes here and comes up and Joe makes as well, but we'll come back to that. So the point here is that agnosticism is not and has never been the claim that you think that God's existence is exactly 50-50. In fact, I don't think that Huxley or other agnostics traditionally would have affirmed any such thing because they express ignorance about it. They don't know. If you are 50-50, then in a sense you don't know, but you actually have fairly precise estimations of acquaintances, right? I don't think that that's what Huxley would have said. I think he would say, look, we don't know. And if you think that you can say 50-50, you're fooling yourself because we don't have knowledge of such things. At any rate, to say that, yeah, sorry, I'm just looking at what Digital Notice is here. Draper calls Huxley's view global agnosticism, which is distinct from local agnosticism, which is fine. The point I'm simply making here is that agnosticism is much more, or at least it's not simply reducible to being equally 50-50 about whether God exists or not. And so I just don't accept this as an objection. My opinion is that using atheism as in the Lacktheist sense, so in a broad sense of anyone who lacks belief in God, agnostics do count as atheists. And I think that's a perfectly acceptable consequence because they're often lumped together anyway. How often do people talk about atheists and agnostics as a single group to refer to their collective fact of being what Joe would like us to call non-theists? From my point of view, that's a distinction without a difference. We'll get to that. The point is that it's not crazy to lump in the agnostics with the atheists for some purposes, at least, because there often are anyway. So, and the usage of the term, I don't think historically cuts that out because it's not saying that it's 50-50. So I don't accept Joe's argument here. I think it's a very bad argument that just doesn't address really what agnosticism actually is or how it's used. So let's now jump back to the video. I wish I could, there's probably a way to have both of these up, but I'm not sufficiently intelligent to work that out at this point. All right, let's keep going.
Analysis is that suppose that this person that we're talking about, this kind of neutral 50-50 person, suppose they take Pascal's wager and they make a practical commitment to a life-serving God. So they go to church services, they say their prayers and all the other stuff, but they still think God's existence and non-existence are equally probable. And so they lack a belief in God. Now, I don't think that they're atheists, even though per this definition they would count as atheists, right? It just seems obviously wrong to say that they're atheists. They're literally going to
Well, it doesn't seem to me obviously wrong. Let's see why he thinks it's obviously wrong.
church, the praying, and so on. They have a kind of practical commitment, but they don't have that doxastic aspect. The third problem is that...
But hang on. We just talked about this. So agnosticism is used in a psychological sense in many cases. That is, it refers to someone's mental state. It's precisely a doxastic claim, that just a claim that relates to beliefs. It's one of these silly philosophical terms that philosophers like to use when I think it just makes things unclear. But anyway, the point, I think it's a doxastic term to use that language. Agnosticism, it's what you believe. Like, it's in the name, Gnostic, right? Agnostic, lacking knowledge. So why would we be surprised to say that someone falls under the category of an atheist if that counts, if that encompasses anyone who lacks a belief in God? If that person lacks a belief in God, like, that's not surprising, right? To say that, well, they can't really be an atheist because they're going to church and they're praying or whatever. But that's a practice. That's a practical commitment. That's not asking that's not with respect to what they believe, right? I mean, maybe some Jews fit in this category, right? That they may be practicing in the sense that they're part of that cultural practice, but they don't actually believe. Those people, I would say, are atheistic Jews. They practice Judaism, but don't believe. Like, this is I think it's perfectly coherent. It makes perfect sense to talk about it that way. Joe's just speaking as if it doesn't make any sense at all. But I don't understand his argument. He's saying that this doxastic notion of certainly agnosticism, but I would also say atheism, that's the Lacktheist perception, can't apply to someone who is taking Pascal's wager because they're pragmatically devoted to it. But that's not doxastic, as he just said. So it seems to be a confusion here, making a practical objection to a doxastic claim. It just doesn't make sense to me.
Suppose that we alter the story that I just gave of the neutral atheist. So suppose that we say that the person thinks the evidence is roughly counterbalanced, but slightly, ever so slightly weighs in favor of theism. So in this case, they could assign, let's say, a 52% probability to God's existence and a 48% probability to God's non-existence. Now, this person obviously doesn't believe in God, right? Like, they don't represent the world as being one in which God exists. They do not affirm as true the proposition that God exists. Instead, they merely think it's like ever so slightly more probable than not. But they wouldn't go so far as to say that they actually believe the proposition to be true, full stop. So the definition that we're considering would count this person as an atheist. But I think that that's just a mistake, right? Someone who thinks God's existence is literally more probable than not should not count as an atheist under your definition. So those are some initial problems. I have 6 more problems. They're shorter than the one we just gave, but I have 6 more problems.
Bugger, I spilt my water. Yoda's betrayed me. Anyway, so the idea that if someone believes that God's existence is very slightly more likely than not, but doesn't affirm his existence, are they an atheist? That's an interesting case, right? But this is where I fall back on what I was saying before. Definitions that provide necessary and sufficient conditions for applying, I think, are often not helpful, or at least highly limited. And this is an example of that. I would say, look, it's not necessarily because belief is not binary. Like, someone doesn't just believe in God or not believe in God. I mean, a lot of people are fine to binarize themselves, right, like that, to just discretize themselves as being, yes, I'm in this camp, or yes, I'm not in that camp. But there are some people who are somewhere in the middle, and they're not happy to just say yes or no. They say, look, I'm 51-49 or I'm 55-45. I've known people like this, right, who are very unsure and won't be willing to commit either way. And they also won't call themselves agnostics because they think they do have knowledge. They're just not sure, or they're really marginal. So in those cases, I would simply say it's unclear what these people are, and they're sort of vaguely, they're like I guess they're partially theists and partially not theists. Like, they're in a state of sort of ambiguity, or of unclarity with respect to their beliefs. And I think that just is the answer in that case. If someone is like literally 51-49, so is it appropriate to call them an atheist? Well, no, not without qualification. But is it appropriate to call them a theist? No, not without qualification. It's a vague case, right? Just because there are vague cases doesn't mean that the term can't have application in other cases, right? This is like just to say, well, this is the classic example of where do you draw the line between a short person and a tall person? Or I guess a medium, like a normal-sized person and a tall person. Well, any line that you draw is arbitrary and can't be defended, right? So clearly there's no such thing as tall people. Obviously, that's not correct. And obviously, that's not what Joe's saying here. But it appears to be the structure of that argument. He seems to be saying, look, if you can give a 51-49 case for someone who, but yet nevertheless won't affirm God's existence, then surely that falsifies the idea that an atheist is just someone who lacks belief. Well, no, all that shows is that these concepts are vague. And in some cases, it's going to be ambiguous, or it's going to be sort of a gradation between them. Now, many people are sufficiently far to the edges such that you can just categorically say they're an atheist or they're a theist or whatever. But there are a small number of people who are in that middle zone where you're just going to have to be more cautious, or it's not going to be categorically one or the other. I don't think that undermines the notion of atheism.
Problems with this? I'm going to turn it over to you, Cameron, to see if you have any questions on that.
6. No.
The notion of atheism as Lacktheism, I should specify.
Let's continue, because I mean, I just have a couple things to say, but and I've even done a show with Chris Gadsden, which was a really good show. You guys should go check it out. I think I can't remember the title of it, but yeah, continue your 6, and then I'll talk a little bit.
Okay, so first, it is this kind of.
So he's still objecting to atheism as a Lacktheism, which again I don't think is that interesting. I prefer just to defend a straight out naturalism position. But if it's the biggest mistake made by atheists, I think it's worth talking about. So that we're still on that point here.
Definition of atheism is contradicted by actual usage in contemporary philosophy, and in particular philosophy of religion. And these are the experts on how to properly define the concepts in question. So for instance, Paul Draper, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, he points out that atheism means the negation of theism, the denial of the existence of God. So that was a direct quote from him. You can also look at atheism is not defined as a lack of belief, but instead as belief in the proposition that God does not exist. In the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the second edition, that's in 2006, you can find it in the Oxford Companion to Philosophy, the Blackwell Dictionary of Western Philosophy, the Rutledge Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and so on. So that's the first point. The second point is that a term already exists for those who lack a belief in God. It's non-theist. So for instance, Charles Taliaferro, Paul Draper, and Philip Quinn, in one of their Blackwell companions, distinguish between atheists and other non-theist perspectives. The term non-theist is already a far more precise and standard word to describe those who lack a belief in God. It can also accommodate agnostics and whatnot, and innocence, to use Graham Oppy's phrase. Third, Draper gives in his Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
That has got to be. So I want to comment on the non-theist part and come back to a reference he made to the Stanford Encyclopedia, because I want to say more about that. But the non-theist, this has to be one of the silliest things I've heard anyone say with respect to the Lacktheism perspective. I don't want to be rude there, but I just think it's so silly to say that, look, we've got a word for Lacktheist and it's just non-theist. My understanding is that that term is newer than atheism, and more importantly than that, most people have no idea what the difference is between atheist and non-theist, right? This is, look, if you're publishing philosophical journals and it's helpful to make that precise distinction, okay, fine. But in ordinary conversation, in nearly any context, a non-theist is an atheist, right? They mean the same thing. No one is going to know which one is which. And I sometimes forget when I think about this. Wait, which is the one that's supposed to be all of them, and which is the one that's supposed to be the negation? Like, it's just, I mean, you think about the prefix atheism, and non-theist. It's the same. It's the same meaning. They mean the same thing. Again, in a philosophical context, there may be more precise definitions, but in almost every other context, to say that, look, we've got this word and that's actually non-theism. Like, you could just reverse the argument and say, actually, it's non-theism that's the specific term, and it's atheism. That, like, and it would, like, no one would bat an eye. They're like, yeah, that's it. Like, it makes just as much sense the other way. I just think that is so silly. When you're going to say, no, you can't call yourselves, you can't be Lacktheists as atheists. You're non-theists. I mean, come on, really? I think that's just so silly. Anyway. But I want to come back to the point he made about the Stanford Encyclopedia article, but he's got more to say with respect to that point. So I'll let him make those points and then come back to that. And yeah, people are saying that they're not really into this whole label stuff. Look, I agree. I don't really think it matters that much, but I thought it was worth responding to because it's part of this video.
An argument against conceding atheism as a lack of belief. So the argument is, one, it makes sense to say that theism is true or false and to argue for or against theism. Two, but it doesn't make sense to say that a psychological state is true or false, and it doesn't make sense to like argue for a psychological state or against a psychological state. And so it follows that theism is not a psychological state. But so Draper argues atheism should be defined in terms of theism. And if theism is not a psychological state and atheism is defined solely in terms of theism, well, then it follows that atheism itself is not a psychological state. But if atheism is merely the state of lacking a belief in God, then it is a psychological state. So by modus tollens, it follows that atheism is not the state of lacking a belief in God. The third problem. Fourth problem.
Draper.
Exactly, I know.
I hate it when people say by modus tollens. I don't like Latin terms when they're used without definitions because most people don't know what they mean and they're just unnecessary. Anyway, but that's just another peeve of mine. Let's focus on substance here. So this argument is saying that basically, as I understand it, I don't want to have to go through repeatedly to make sure I get that precisely, but he's saying something along the lines that atheism is supposed to be the rejection of theism, and theism is a proposition, so atheism should be a proposition. But if you define it in terms of Lacktheism, that's not a proposition, it's a psychological state, and psychological states can't have truth values. Therefore, under the Lacktheism understanding, atheism couldn't be true or false. I just disagree with this, unsurprisingly. So let's see. I wanted to share another bugger. Now I can't find it. Stanford Encyclopedia article. Just before I bring it up, I want to find where it is. Oh, here it is. Yes. Okay. Let's share this. Which one is it? This one. Okay, this is the article on truth. Probably the canonical one. Subsection truth and language. Okay, so the claim here by Paul Draper, and you're sure, Draper is entitled to this view. It's not an uncommon view, but is it the only view? The view stated here is that propositions have truth values, and beliefs don't have truth values. And if Lacktheism is just a psychological state, so a state of belief, it can't have truth values. Well, let's see what Stanford Encyclopedia has to say about that. Oh, bugger, why do I always do that? Oh, I zoom in, that goes all over the place. Hang on. Okay, here we go. What are the truth bearers? There have been many debates in the literature over what the primary bearers of truth are. So what are the things that are either true or false? That's what it means to be a bearer of truth. Candidates typically include beliefs, propositions, sentences, and utterances. Wait, what? Candidates typically include beliefs, propositions, sentences, and utterances. Yes, you heard it right, folks. So there is debate about what the primary bearers of truth are, and propositions is a very standard notion. It's to be sure, but it's not the only one. There are people who argue that it's beliefs, that it's sentences, utterances. There's lots of different views here about what is the primary truth bearer, the bearer of truth in philosophy. It's not wrong to say that you think it's propositions. What I think it's wrong to say is that it's just a fact that it's propositions, and like to use that as a premise as if it's uncontroversial and can't be argued against. That's rubbish. I think that, in fact, psychological states can be bearers of truth values, or at least I lean towards saying that. And so, because of that, I don't accept that this argument against Lacktheism on the basis that, well, if Lacktheism refers to a psychological state's kind of truth values, therefore atheism can't be true or false, which seems wrong. I'm happy to say that psychological states can have truth values. So I don't see the reason to accept this. Again, I'm not saying you have to agree with that. You can say, no, you're wrong, and it's propositions, and here's why. That's all fine. But I don't think it's appropriate to make these assertions when there are other options, plausible options that are discussed on the table. And I was just showing that to as illustrate the point that I'm making, that you don't have to accept that only propositions can be truth bearers here. All right, let's go back again to the video. I'm going to forget audio one of these times, so yell at me when I do, but I just clicked it then. Okay, so let's see. So we got the psychological state argument and with the non-theism argument. What other arguments does he have?
He's like dropping the mic here. So the fourth thing is that it seems plausible that atheism should be a direct answer to the most important metaphysical question in philosophy of religion. Is there a God? As Paul Draper writes, quote, there are only two possible direct answers to that question. Yes, which is theism, and no, which is atheism. Answers like I don't know, no one knows, I don't care, I don't have a psychological state of affirming the proposition, and so on, are not direct answers to that question, end quote. So that's a fourth consideration. A fifth consideration. Draper
does say that in the article. I just think it's a very silly argument. What does it mean to give a direct answer to the question? Okay, someone asks you, is 47869432894.638? Yeah, well, I was going to say, is it a prime number, but I just gave it a decimal, which doesn't make sense. You get the idea. I just give you an arbitrary number and ask, is this a prime number? And you say, I don't know. That is a direct answer to the question, I contend. It's just silly to say that, no, the only direct answers are yes or no. I don't know is a perfectly acceptable and a very direct answer to that question. And what are the other ones that are supposed to be non-direct answers as well? He says, what was it? No one knows, I don't care. An affirmative answer has never been established. The question is meaningless. I think those are all direct answers to the question. An indirect answer would be to start talking about something else and like change the subject. That's an indirect answer. Or to tell you about, well, look, I'm a naturalist. So, okay, someone asks me, do I believe in God? And I say, I'm a naturalist. That is an indirect answer to the question. Because plausibly, under most definitions of theism, naturalism precludes theism, right? So that I've indirectly answered the question. Or if I say something like, if someone asks me, are you a theist or do you believe in God? And I say, well, actually, when I grew up a theist, but I left religion quite a long time ago. That indirectly answers the question, because I may have come back to religion, right? It's not a direct answer, but you can imply what I'm saying there, right? So those would be what I would call indirect answers. Saying I don't know or no one knows is a direct answer to the question. So I just don't understand this argument. I think it's a really silly argument that the only two direct answers are yes and no, and therefore, atheism must be the no position, as opposed to, I don't know or I don't have that belief. I respect Draper a lot, but I think that's a really weak argument.
If an atheist is someone who lacks a belief in God, well, then what is atheism? Well, is it the proposition that there is no God? Well, if so, then we have a really strange asymmetry in our definitions of atheist and atheism, right? If the former is merely a description of one's psychological state, well, then the latter, it seems weird to say that it's an actual claim that God doesn't exist. And so instead, it seems that we have to define atheism as merely the state of lacking a belief in God. That's really the only way to be consistent with your definition of an atheist as someone who lacks a belief in God. But if atheism is merely the state of lacking a belief in God, then there can be no arguments against atheism. Arguments only conclude to propositions or claims. You can't have an argument that concludes, therefore, the state of lacking a belief in God is false, or therefore...
This is complete nonsense, right? It's completely appropriate to have, again, it depends on what you think truth bearers are and all this other stuff, as I mentioned before, but it's completely acceptable to say, to talk about the considerations in virtue of which a belief is rational, irrational, or acceptable or unacceptable, or evidenced and non-evidenced, right? This is the evidentialist position that it came up at some point, right? The idea that it's only defensible or justifiable, or I forget the exact word, to believe in something when there's sufficient evidence for it. The idea that you can't give an argument for a belief is just silly. I mean, okay, if you believe that only propositions can have truth values and that arguments are to establish the truth or falsity of propositions, then okay, yes, under that narrow framework, that's true. But you don't have to accept that framework. I think it's very standard to talk about evidence for and against, or arguments for and against a belief, or saying how rational is it to hold a particular belief. So I think this is just a really weak argument to say, look, you can't have a Lacktheist because then it can't have truth values and then you can't give arguments against it. That's just... I think this is the worst form of sophistry in philosophy. Like, no, you just don't have to think of it that way. You can think of it that way if you want, but I don't think that's forced on anyone else if they don't agree with that usage of the term.
For the state of lacking a belief in God is true. That just doesn't make any sense.
I didn't know that, Paulo.
So thank you for determining the conclusion that God exists is not an argument against atheism, and that seems really weird. And so anyway, I'll just stop there. There are so many problems. There are more problems, by the way. I had to cut off.
Don't stop. Give me more.
No, we're good.
Take that quote out of context. Sorry, immature joke there. All right, I wanted to show something else about this article because Joe is quoting Paul Draper there in the Stanford Encyclopedia, and it appears that Draper supports him broadly, but I think he's not showing the whole story there. So let me now share this article, and let's have a look at the atheism part, because I looked at before at the agnosticism part. Okay, so I'm going to kind of skip over the points that we've already talked about, or that Joe's already talked about. Now, we've got to get this right here. So yeah, he's saying that, these answers are not direct answers. I think that's a silly argument. Okay, here he says, well, identifying atheism with the metaphysical claim that there is no God, which is what Joe wants to say, as opposed to the Lacktheist notion that it's just lacking a belief in God. It is particularly useful for doing philosophy. So he's saying, yeah, look, that's good for doing philosophy. It is important to recognize that the term atheism is polysemous. That means it has more than one meaning. They're related but distinct meanings, even within philosophy. For example, many writers at least implicitly identify atheism with the positive metaphysical theory like naturalism or materialism. That's a slightly separate point, but that is also true, which will come up in a moment. Hang on, I've sort of lost where I wanted to keep talking about that. Perhaps a case can even be made for the claim that something like metaphysical naturalism was originally labeled atheism only because of the cultural dominance of non-naturalistic forms of theism. That actually relates to something like, actually, I talked about this in my previous video. So, who was it? It was the guy who wrote Leviathan. Names again. Who wrote Leviathan? See, I remember the name of the book, but I don't remember the name of the philosopher. No, not that Leviathan. Oh, someone in chat will get before I Google it. I talked about him in my previous video when I was talking about the mechanical philosophy. They want the text bigger. Yeah, I'll get to that. I'm trying to remember who I was talking about. They called him an atheist because it seemed that his mechanical philosophy left no room for God. Thomas Hobbes. There we go. Okay. Yeah, so Thomas Hobbes was called an atheist because his mechanical philosophy seemed to leave no room for God. And I think that is... Yeah, why am I making this bigger? Sorry about that. Yeah, and so I think the point is being made here that the usage across history has been quite varied, and it's often been equated with naturalism, or in the Christian example, just with disbelief in the pagan gods. Although this definition of atheism is a legitimate one, it is often accompanied by fallacious inferences from the alleged falsity or probable falsity of atheism equals naturalism to the truth or possible truth of theism. I agree with that. We shouldn't equate the two, but acknowledge that that has been a history of that usage. Now, this is what I really want to look at here. Departing even more radically from the norm in philosophy, a few philosophers and quite a few non-philosophers claim that atheism shouldn't be defined as a proposition at all, even if theism is a proposition. And I'm actually happy to say that theism is also a sort of a mental state or a doxastic state. But anyway, instead, atheism should be defined as a psychological state, the state of not believing in the existence of God. So that is Lacktheism there. It's a psychological understanding of atheism. This view was famously proposed by the philosopher Anthony Flew and arguably played a role in his defense of the alleged presumption of atheism. The editors of the Oxford Handbook of Atheism also favor this definition, and one of them, Stephen Bullivant, defends it on the grounds of scholarly utility. His argument is that this definition can serve as an umbrella term for a wide variety of positions that have been identified with atheism. Scholars can use adjectives like strong or weak to develop a taxonomy that differentiates various specific atheisms. I agree with that. I think that is spot on. Unfortunately, this argument overlooks the fact that if atheism is defined as a psychological state, then no proposition could count as a form of atheism because a proposition is a psychological state. See, yes, a proposition is not a psychological state, but a proposition can represent a psychological state or can represent the propositional content of a psychological state. Like, you can map between them. I think that this is just not a good argument. But anyway, I mean, there's stuff to be said there. I don't think that's a good argument. This undermines his argument in defense of Flew's definition, for it implies that what he calls strong atheism is not really a variety of atheism at all. I don't agree with that. I think that you can draw a close connection between propositions and psychological states, but without them being the same thing. So anyway, so Draper is criticizing this definition here, but notice what he says at the end here. Now I've got to find it. It goes on quite some length about this. New atheists. I know there was some claim that I made about here. Okay, there was something at the end here I wanted to show, but I can't quite find it. I think we've got the idea though. So it is true that broadly speaking, in this article, Paul Draper is objecting to Lacktheist usages of the term atheism. However, he does point out that the term is polysemous. It doesn't just have one meaning, and is specifically non-philosophically, it's standardly used in a Lacktheist sense. And he's pointed out Anthony Flew and the authors of the Handbook of Atheism, the Oxford Handbook of Atheism, also argued for this definition. I would add to that Barrett Holbach, one of the very first prominent atheists, who also used a definition like this. So it's not as if it's completely unreasonable or unjustified to use this as a definition, especially if you're not just operating in a narrowly philosophical context. So I'm quite happy to say, sure, in the philosophical discourse, atheism is understood as a proposition that rejects the existence of God, is a rejection of theism. But not everyone is just using the term in that narrowly philosophical context. And nor are they in bad company. We've just given those examples of Anthony Flew and Baron de Holbach and the authors of the handbook who use it in those terms. And so I don't really see the problem. As long as we're clear about people's definitions, what they mean in a given conversation. So what's the issue here? So the point is, I think that these objections are really overstated. Most of them aren't very good or are only suggestive. And at most they suggest that, look, there's a standard usage in philosophy when you're giving arguments that atheism is a proposition. It's not just a lack of belief. Okay, sure. But does everyone have to use that specific sense of the word atheism to be allowed into the discourse? No, they don't. They're in good company. And it's a perfectly, I think, sound and sensible definition if it has certain disadvantages, maybe in a narrowly philosophical context. But if you're not interested in being in that space, then it's fine. I don't understand the need for this gatekeeping or to speak as if like no sensible person has ever used the term this way, or that it's just a new atheist term, which it is not. We've seen this predates that by centuries, actually. So I really, and many of the arguments are given depend on very particular views about like the nature of propositions or what are truth bearers and things, which I just don't think are good arguments. So I strongly object to this, and mostly the reason is just because it's another form of gatekeeping. It's a way of saying, look, if you're going to say you're an atheist but you're a Lacktheist, then you don't know what you're talking about. Go home and rethink your labels, kind of thing, and you're not allowed to define yourself that way. I don't agree with that. Some labels are just non-defensible, but I don't think Lacktheism is. It's one way of talking about atheism which has a long pedigree. And as long as you know how the person's using the term, it's fine.
Well, you only got 5. Give me, what's the 6th one?
Let's see. Oh, no, it turns out that I must have deleted it because I went way over. I had to shave this down, by the way, because there are more considerations. I had like quotes from different encyclopedia of philosophy and things like that, but I had to cut them down. But in total, actually, I guess I'll just summarize. I've given a total of, I believe, 7 different problems. So first, defining atheism as lack of belief. These are 7 problems. First, okay. So if you include humors, like his 3 different reasons. Oh, yeah. Well, first, it succumbs to counterexamples like the cases of the Pascalian agnostic and the agnostic with very slight lean towards theism.
I don't think that those are problematic counterexamples. I'm happy to say in the first case that the person is an atheist, and and I think that's standard usage. In the second case, it's sort of vague and they don't fit clearly in any category, because I think that the notion of necessary and sufficient conditions is often not helpful anyway.
Second, it collapses the distinction between atheists and agnostics. Third, it is contradictory.
I disagree with that, because that's only true if you consider agnosticism as just being 50-50 percentages, but I don't think that's what agnosticism is. It's a claim about knowledge, not just a claim about how confident you are in the existence of God. So I don't agree that it collapses that definition.
By actual usage in contemporary philosophy, and in particular philosophy of religion, who are the experts on defining the concept in question. Fourth,
that's true, although you don't have to use that term. As the article we looked at pointed out, the term is polysemous, and there's a long history of quite knowledgeable people using it in the Lacktheist sense, and so it's an acceptable sense to use it as well. Maybe just don't use it in that sense when publishing a philosophy paper.
The term non-theist is already a far more precise and standard word to describe those who lack a belief in God. Fifth,
maybe I don't know if that's even true in philosophy. I guess maybe he would know better than me, so I'll defer to him on that. But I just generally hear people talking about non-theist and atheist fairly interchangeably. I don't know that there's a big difference between there, or that adds any concision. And really, it seems that the words mean the same thing to me.
Theism should be defined in terms of theism. This is Draper's argument, and since theism is not a psychological state, neither is atheism.
Well, you can just disagree with that. I mean, why isn't theism a psychological state? I think that can just be objected. As I mentioned before, psychological states can have truth values. If you like, there are theories according to which those can have truth values, so you just don't have to accept that classification.
Sixth, it redirects discussion away from the metaphysical issue of God's existence and towards the irrelevant issue of one's psychological state. And
how is that irrelevant? This is, I don't remember him mentioning that before, but this is really bad form of gatekeeping, right? It's like, no, we can't debate about what you believe. We have to debate about the argument, right? This is what philosophers do, right? They distance themselves from what people believe and just focus on arguments. And that's fine. I think there's a lot of value in that, right? But we can't say that that's all people are allowed to do. What Joe says here is that it's irrelevant what you believe or what anyone believes. It's just the argument. But what are arguments for if they're not for shaping beliefs? And no one cares about, or hardly anyone cares about this. Maybe Joe does, but most people don't care about this independently of what they believe or what their friends and family believe about it. They care about it precisely because people believe this stuff or disbelieve this stuff, right? So that is absolutely relevant. So if someone tells you I lack a belief in God and I use an atheist to describe myself, you're going to respond to them, well, that's redirecting the question. We need to focus on how good the argument is, not what you believe. Go away, silly person who wants to focus on what they believe. Joe didn't say that, but that seems to be what he's implying. He said that it's irrelevant what people believe. How silly is that? Like, that's the whole point of these conversations. I just can't understand why someone would say it's irrelevant what people believe about theism or atheism. Of course that's relevant.
Seventh, it entails absurdly that an argument for theism is not an argument against atheism. So those are my 7 reasons. There are more, by the way. But
that last point would just be about whether you can have like truth values of psychological states, which I think you can, so I don't accept that as a valid argument. So I think they're all pretty bad arguments. The only one that I accept is that it's standard usage in contemporary analytic philosophy to refer to atheism as the denial of theism. And I'm happy to say, look, yeah, if you're engaging in that space, then you should probably not use the term Lacktheism unless you have a very good reason for it. But most people aren't engaging in that specific space, so it's perfectly fine for them to use Lacktheism to describe their own beliefs or describe the beliefs of others. And I don't think any of the other arguments are sufficient to refute that. And they just the whole thing's a form. The whole thing is a form of gatekeeping and distraction, which I really don't like. So if people want to call themselves Lacktheist, just let them call themselves Lacktheist. Let's move on with our lives.
And this is, I think, going back to humor. Basically, you can have a correct or incorrect definition. And so here's one of the examples that I think Chris gave in the interview that I did with him. So basically, if you want to say in a conversation that a horse is anything with wheels, then you're just wrong. Like you've got a wrong.
Yeah, I think we can move beyond.
Is happening is that you're just a bad. If I was to go into a photography studio and start,
yeah.
You just don't. I don't know. You're kind of like, oh, I just got to rebel. I don't know.
Let's hear it.
It's not as crazy as yours. So my number one is, and this is like the top thing that I see consistent.
Okay, so this is Cameron's. So Joe's number one mistake that atheists make is Lacktheism, and so here's Cameron's number one. Yeah. So this is basically what I was sort of say. This is what I mean. It's a bit too much like an intellectual chess game in philosophy for Joe. It's not what people really believe or how that affects their lives. Now, for me, yeah, I really dislike that. I think philosophy should be action guiding and belief guiding and should relate to people's lives. And we should take things that they're concerned about and then and invite them to think more carefully about that and see what tools philosophy has for answering it. So there's an intimate connection. Now, maybe Joe would say that as well, but it doesn't appear to, maybe not, I'm not sure. But that doesn't come across. Just look at the whole Lacktheism discussion. He's trying to hit people over the head with, you can't call yourself Lacktheist because of these very abstract, like some of the, psychological states don't have truth values. Like most people aren't going to understand what he means by that. What is the point of that? Like, is that to help people think more clearly? Maybe, but I think plausibly not. It's just to try to make people conform themselves to a particular usage within modern academic philosophy. And the question is why? If they don't want to engage in that particular domain, why do we have to say they must use the term in that way? In some context, you maybe want to clarify with them exactly what they mean by that. Sure, that's one thing. Clarification's good. And making them aware that, okay, in other contexts, this isn't necessarily what philosophers mean, that's also fine. But then to say that it's like the biggest mistake they make is just to use those terms. That's when I think that philosophy stops being a help to our reasoning and starts being just a way to, again, a stick to beat people over the head with. So, or a gate that you lock and don't let people in, like a gatekeeping thing. And that's what I really dislike. So, all right. Let's see what Cameron says.
So you kind of mentioned it when you were saying your second one, but you didn't really focus on it. So I was happy that I could actually just say it. So basically, it's just a failure to care about good philosophy. I think that this is just so rampant. And it's, again, mine are not like specific things that atheists are because I think a lot of Christians have bad epistemology. I think that a lot of Christians attack weak versions of arguments. And I think that a lot of Christians fail to care about good philosophy. But what I've seen consistently from atheists that I've interacted with and atheist YouTubers is that they don't look at it. It's not just...
Mind blown. I'll let you do that yourself. Some horses do have wheels. Well, sort of. Anyway, good philosophy. Let's see what Cameron has to say about that.
Like, you're not, okay, so someone like Luke Barnes, he's got, probably the best version of the fine-tuning argument. It's not just that they're not interacting with someone like Luke Barnes when they try to critique the fine-tuning argument. It's not just that. It's that they don't even know the name Paul Draper. They don't even know the name Graham Oppie in a lot of cases, right? So they're not even utilizing the people that are on their own side, who are the smartest people, who have given the most rigorous arguments, the best arguments. And it's like, to me, I just don't understand that. When I was getting into philosophy, into apologetics, the first thing I wanted to do was like, who are the best people? Where's the best argument? I want to know, like, who's given the most rigorous version of the fine-tuning argument, of the cosmological argument. I want to know what the best version is by the smartest person. And I want to like know that one. And I want to, if that's the argument, that's the best argument, I want to, not only do I want to know that argument, I want to know what are the best responses to this argument by the smartest atheists or by the smartest other people. And I just don't see that. It's not, again, this one, and this is just, you didn't really do this, so you probably did a better job than I did. But this is not just something that atheists do, but it's something that everyone does. And I just don't understand it. But if we, instead of doing that, if we raised up and started focusing on the best, started focusing on the Michael Tooley version of the problem of evil, the Paul Draper, he's got like 7 different versions of the problem of evil in his work. If we started focusing on that, oh my gosh, everyone would be so much better off. We'd be able to make so much more, I don't know about progress, but it would just be, I say progress because I think the real progress actually happens in the literature and by the actual philosophers. But it would make for such a better atmosphere. Maybe that's the right term to use. So that's my rant. I'll get off my soapbox. What do you have to say about that?
All right. Can you say gatekeeping? I say gate. You say keeping. Gate. Keeping. It's like, no, you can't engage in these discussions unless you're reading Graham Oppie and you're reading Paul Draper and you're reading, well, I didn't mention, but like William Lane Craig or Swinburne or whoever it is, right? I I really dislike this, right? Apologetics, philosophy, and I'd add science and history and other disciplines like that. It should be to help people. And we should try to make these things accessible to people and relevant to people. Now, that doesn't mean we don't encourage people to learn more and to think more clearly and, and to present better forms of the argument. We absolutely do that. Okay, that is important. But there's a difference between doing that and then saying, look, don't talk to me, don't comment, or, don't engage unless you've, done all this stuff, read all these books, can engage with the best form. That's gatekeeping, right? And I think that is, it's just really toxic and really unhelpful. And spirit of philosophy of loving wisdom, right? You can love wisdom whether you're a PhD philosopher or you're a high school dropout, right? I've actually had people who've, I don't know about high school dropouts, definitely had college dropouts who email me with respect to my Science of Everything podcast and say, look, it's really great. I like that you've helped explain these things that I didn't have the chance to learn in college and like learn more about science. I'm not trying to toot my own horn there. The reason I'm saying that is just because that's what I see a big value of this stuff is. It's trying to make things more accessible to help people learn and to grow in their own way where they're at, right? So we should be trying to help them get access to these arguments and think more rigorously about it for those of us who have the luxury of having the time and education to talk about this. So someone like Cameron, who basically works on this full time, is especially privileged in this respect. And, he does do that to some extent, right? So I don't want to say he doesn't do this at all. He presents, good interviews and so forth. So I don't mean to say that. But when he makes a comment like that, where it's coming across like people can't engage, with these arguments on their own level from where they're at. I'd be interested in what he thinks about whether these people should be Christians, right? If they haven't read the best arguments for and against, like maybe they shouldn't be atheists, but should they be Christians? Like, should all these people just be agnostic until they've read all these articles and all these books and so forth? I don't think that's true. I think that it's perfectly fine for people to adopt views on the basis of where they're at. Now, I think most people are overconfident in their views, but that's a somewhat different question. It's fine for them to have views, and it's particularly fine for them to engage in discussion about them. And it's okay if their objections aren't very good or if their understanding is limited, right? That's where you start from, right? You build on. Everyone starts from a sort of a basic point. One thing I want to object to as well is that, and this is maybe just a semantic point, but I don't like the way that Cameron was saying, look, he wants to find the best arguments from the smartest people. He mentioned this a couple of times. Look, intelligence is very important, but you can't assume that an argument is good just because an intelligent person says it, or that the best arguments necessarily come from the most intelligent people. There's a form of intellectual snobbery here that really irritates me. I don't think intelligence always has much to do with it. You can be very intelligent, but have many. So intelligence is what I would describe as an intellectual. I don't even know if I want to say virtue. I mean, maybe it's a positive. Let's say it's epistemically positive, but there are many other aspects of what I'd say intellectual virtues that are more important than that. So curiosity is one. Open-mindedness is another one. Sort of skepticism, appropriate skepticism is another one of them. Engaging in like groupthink is another one. So there's many of these important virtues that I think are more important for shaping whether work is good or not. People who are sort of, self-critical, open-minded, look at things from a diversity of points of view, not dogmatic, genuinely curious, and all this sort of stuff. I think that is actually more important and widely read as well, which is also separate from intelligence. A lot of that is more important than just how intelligent you are. And as Digital Notice is saying, intelligent people are often the best at rationalizing false beliefs, right? So I'm not denigrating intelligence here. I just don't like this equation of intelligence with like the best. Maybe that was just Cameron's way of articulating the point, but I just think it was not well articulated if you're drawing that connection. Why don't we just talk about the best arguments, right? And not link it to intelligence of the people who made them? Because you see, that implies that if you're not intelligent, you can't make good arguments, or you won't make good arguments. And I think that's wrong. Often sort of objectively, like not intelligent people can actually make good points quite often, and they have a maybe more grounded way of thinking about things. And I think we can learn from each other, right? So I don't like that sort of intellectual snobbery there. And so the overall objection, though, that Cameron is making is that atheists don't engage with the best philosophy. Is that true? Yes, it is broadly true, and I've been critical of that as well. And there are atheists, someone like Richard Dawkins, for example, who is in a position to know and do better, then should inform himself more than he often does or has in the past. So there is criticism that can be made here. However, when we're talking about your average atheist, even a lot of YouTubers, it's completely legitimate for them to make objections on the basis of how they interact with theism, things that they're concerned about, what they know, and not to say, well, we're not even going to listen to you, or you're not even relevant, or whatever, just because you're not engaging with the Richard Swinburnes or the William Lane Craigs, or whatever else, whoever you think the smartest people are. And of course, when people are making arguments, we can say, well, I don't think that's a good argument. Here's a better version. That's fine as well. Like, we can critique each other in that sense, but it's the gatekeeping aspect of it, and saying that people can't engage in the conversation unless they reach this sort of very high threshold, which I really dislike. So I don't think that's a mistake. It's just, I mean, it's just to say that, yeah, the intellectual bar could be raised. There are a lot of mistakes atheists make. They could do better. But the gatekeeping aspect of it, I think, is just really really wrong-headed.
Yeah, no, I was hinting at that in my second point. I like scientism and the devaluation of philosophy. I didn't go much into the devaluation of philosophy, but I feel like it's almost like pervasive in just behind a lot of these things, right? Like Lacktheism, right? They are like, I don't know, it's like, I think the sixth point, I'm actually remembering what I deleted. My point.
Yeah,
well, let me
exactly.
cut you off. As you're thinking about that, let me cut you off because I said this in our Facebook chat. I was like, the biggest problem with atheism is just Ricky Gervais. And Ricky Gervais basically embodies what I just said. He cares about no good philosophy. Everything he says is basically a slogan, it's something that can be debunked within like 30 seconds of thinking about it rigorously. And it's like he just embodies like all of the worst of new atheism. And I think it all kind of boils down to, maybe you were just about to talk about this. It all kind of boils down to this, just like devaluation of philosophy and good thinking. And like,
all right, so will someone tell me in chat what Ricky Gervais is? What's his profession? Let you have a think about that. Interesting to see how long the delay is. Yep, first answer. Oh, you know, mate, I'm not going to read this name out. I tried last week. He's a comedian. Good. I mean, I would have also accepted like actor and director and so on, but I think comedian is probably the single best answer here. He's a comedian. Okay, so are we going to critique a comedian? Snarky asshole, also acceptable. Yes, I'm sure he'd be happy with that. Are we going to accept the criticism that an atheistic comedian can't make atheistic quips in their comedy because they're not philosophically rigorous? This is silly, right? Mockery has an important place. Yes, a lot of the stuff he says is not, and probably most of it is not philosophically rigorous. You don't expect that from a comedian, right? He's a comedian. I just don't understand this objection. One objection could be that some people think that the things that he says, they interpret some of the things that he says as having greater weight than they should because they're not like rigorous arguments or anything like that. And yeah, okay, so there may be people who do that. Fine. But that's about the way you interpret or react to him. That's not what he's actually doing. He's being a comedian, right? Often good comedians have there's sort of a truth in what they're saying, but they're also exaggerating it. They're presenting in a particular way. So, oh wow, that's pretty cool. I wonder how did you get that accolade? Maybe you can ask him how he defines himself. That would be interesting. But the point is, yeah. So people may abuse him, or maybe they may abuse what he says in the sense that they think that it's more than it is. It's comedy. It's no more than that. It's no less than that. Okay. The idea that he can't do what he's doing because it's not rigorous philosophy is silly. Just as you could just flip it around. You could just say, look, William Lane Craig's fine and all, but he's just not very funny. So he should just stop doing what he's doing because it's boring. That would be a silly objection because William Lane Craig's not trying to be funny. I mean, I'm assuming he's trying to do philosophy. Ricky Gervais is not trying to do philosophy. He's trying to be a comedian. Okay, that is one way of engaging with the question of atheism. I don't think it's a satisfactory way in the sense that like I think you should just only go to comedians. And so that's the sense in which I agree with Cameron. We want to go to philosophers as well, right? But it's an issue of people specializing, right? You're allowed to be an atheist comedian and make jokes about stuff. Should that be your only source of knowledge about these questions? No, it shouldn't be. You should look to better, more rigorous sources as well. But they can coexist. They fulfill different needs. They serve different purposes. So it's perfectly fine for Ricky Gervais to do what he does, just as long as that's put in its appropriate place in terms of what epistemic value it has. Then it's fine.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's so true.
So what does Joe think about this was the question.
But like, I now remember the sixth point that we were talking that you were asking me about. I deleted it. And it was, I think that Lacktheism is actually potentially destructive to natural atheology, where you can define natural atheology as just the project, natural theology is the project of giving arguments from reason for God's existence. Natural atheology is just the project of giving reasons to think there is no God, right?
I.e. the problem of evil.
Yeah, like a problem of evil.
I mean, he's very good at being straight-laced if that's his shtick. But I mean, I guess we could debate that.
Of hiddenness, like Philippe Leon has this huge list, and you can talk on and on about stuff like that. But the point is that Lacktheism, I don't know, it's almost like it's getting people to think like, no, atheism is merely this lack as a negative position. I don't need to have arguments for my position. It's kind of the default. It's like the burden of proof is on you. It's like, but like, meanwhile, natural atheologists like Draper and Oppie, like they're rolling up their sleeves and like, listen, I've got this extreme. You look at my philosophy paper and it's like half math because it's like Bayesian probability and it's like evil and it's like, dude, like this is what natural atheology should be. That is like antithetical to your Lacktheism, right? Because you're
So I'm going to make a hard truth here. And this hits home for me as well, because I'm interested in this stuff, right? But the cold hard truth of it is that no one cares about your philosophy paper that's half math, right? No one cares. Like there's 3 people in the world who are going to read that. Okay, maybe it's 30, whatever, but no one cares about that. And that, that's an issue for me as well, because I'm interested in this stuff and I do actually think it has value, right? So the point though is we can't just sit up in our ivory towers and say, look at my paper that's half math and I'm doing natural atheology, and all you peasants down there, you should have stopped all talking about this. That's gatekeeping, and that's intellectual elitism, which I hate. What we should be doing is saying, look, I work on this stuff and that's my thing, that's fine. But here I'm going to try to explain to you why I think it's important, and connect you in a way that you understand. And like Ricky Gervais is doing that, right? Now, I'm not saying Ricky Gervais is deliberately trying to connect people to the ivory tower, but the point I'm making is that Ricky Gervais is getting people interested in at least thinking about these questions who otherwise might not be, right? At least I think that's plausible, right? That they may not engage with it in any other way. And if that's a way to help get people into thinking about it more seriously, then I think that's all to the good. Now, maybe it can muddy the waters as well. That can be a problem. You don't want to stereotype. You don't want to, put straw man up and so forth. So there's a balance to be had here. But all I'm saying is, if we're going to say, look, atheism's really about writing these half math papers in our ivory towers. That's what it's really about. And anything that distracts from that or is inimical to that is a problem. I say, no, that's not what it's all about. That's a piece of it. That's part of it. It is important. I think it's interesting and it has value, but it's only a small thing that a small set of people do. Most people aren't that interested in it. You have to engage with real atheism as it's really experienced and practiced by real people. And if you're not doing that, then again, well, sort of who cares is kind of the point. You should link what you're doing in your ivory tower to sort of ordinary people. And I'm not getting that sense here. I'm getting the sense that all of the ordinary people and the way they experience and talk about their atheism is kind of irrelevant, and it's ivory tower or bust with respect to how we engage in atheism or what atheism is about. I really don't like that.
Atheism is purely negative enterprise. I think it distracts people from the really good work that's going on in natural atheological circles. It's being published, just like good theistic philosophy is being published every quarterly, So this devaluation of philosophy is kind of implicit in a lot of the things that we've said. It's behind the scientism. I think it's probably behind the Lacktheism. It's probably behind, some of our other problems, like the extraordinary claims of extraordinary evidence. This is all just a polemic in favor of doing good philosophy. So.
I was just thinking.
Unfortunately, a lot of philosophy is crap and not worth reading. To be fair, that's also true of science, although I think the ratio of signal to noise is higher in science than it is in philosophy. I'm a big fan of philosophy, right? I've written a book that's essentially philosophy. I intend to write another one. So I'm not one of these people who, this book that I just happen to have here, Oxford Companions of Philosophy of Mind, okay? I'm not one of these people who says science is useless, but I'm also not starry-eyed about it. And the idea that a lot of it is talking about pseudo questions, over-intellectualizing things that don't need to be, approaching things in I think, strange and bizarre ways, and it's not connected to any ordinary problems or any practical use. There's a lot of issues with philosophy. Now the problem comes in saying that, look, you can only engage in this on a philosophical level. If you're not willing to engage, go home. That's where the problem is, and that appears to be what's being said here. And I strongly disagree with that.
About, because I've heard you do this a couple times today, but I think the reason why you're so good at your Swinburne impersonation is because you actually do some of that yourself.
I know. I actually noticed that in myself. Thank you.
Now I need to get going soon. This has run a bit longer than expected, but there was still half an hour left, so I might just sort of skip quickly through because they've talked about their 6 objections. I can't actually remember exactly what was in the rest of the video, so let me just have a sort of a quick look through. Apologies for doing this.
Okay, I'm done.
I think they did an impression.
I didn't know who that was when you first sent me that, and then.
Oh yeah, his impressions are really good. He should think about moonlighting as an actor or something like that. But I'm going to skip that here because that's not my main purpose. Oh, that's right. They're responding to questions. Let's see. I think that was the quotation from that super chat here. Yeah, that's a joke. We can move past that. Yeah, so there's a lot of positive comments for Joe, which comes back to the thing I mentioned at the start about Joe being an agnostic. Gotta love Joe. He's amazing. Thank you for bringing him on, Cameron. I'm not disagreeing that Joe's a really cool guy and very intelligent, but I'm just going to try to make a point here. I'm going to skip that. Oh, the cumulative casing. I have things to say about that, but I think I'll leave that for now. What are they talking about here?
Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And by that, I mean, and then they show this Bayes theorem, and then they're talking about...
Oh, not Bayes theorem again. Yeah, it's all fine, but you don't have to talk about Bayes theorem to talk about that. I feel like there was a couple of other super chats. Why don't I get all these super chats, by the way? All these super chats coming in. Oh, I'm kidding. If you feel it impressed on your heart, though, if the absent gods that don't exist press it on your heart to donate, then. Please ask your guest if Greg Bannister is a good example of good philosophy. No, we can skip that. Ontological arguments. Yeah, I don't want to talk about that, but I've already said something about ontological arguments. They're sort of the least connected with anyone's real experience, so I'm just going to leave that there. Oh, I do need to comment on this because this sounds like it's directed at the sort of thing I'm interested in doing. So I do feel the need to respond to this.
Saddling themselves with a defense of full-blown reductive materialism / naturalism. Atheism doesn't entail all that.
I love this question. This is such a good question.
So I personally, you're going to get into, I'm sure, a lot of good stuff, but I just want to say I hate the naturalism, supernaturalism distinction. I think it's a really bad distinction. Part of that is that I just don't like, people mean different things by the term. And so when you actually like get some clarity on it, once you actually get clear, I think there's still other problems, but I just don't like that distinction. So I don't know.
I mean, something is natural if it's part of the physical material world, and it's non-natural if it isn't. I mean, yeah, there's some ambiguity there, but it's not, in the scheme of things, it's not that ambiguous. I don't really understand this objection. God has always been taken to, in you know, classical theism, has been taken to be something outside the natural world. So I don't know why he has this issue. But anyway, I don't
that, you know,
want to talk about that aspect of it.
Natural, I don't know. Anyways, I'll let you talk.
Yeah. So no, I think that's good. That it just points to the use of, you know, like slowing down, defining your terms. I think naturalism and supernatural, like that's okay if you could just, you know, sit down and say, tell me what you mean by natural, tell me what you mean by supernatural, and let's define the terms. That's like what Paul Draper does, right? So Paul Draper, for instance, he says, this is what I mean by naturalism. By naturalism, I mean source physicalism. Source physicalism just says that fundamentally in reality, there are physical things, and if there are non-physical things, like
what is a physical thing?
Well,
sorry.
It's a space.
I won't cut you off.
Well, yeah,
Come on, we really don't know what a physical thing is. I mean, is the notion of a physical object really less clear than the notion of an omniscient, omnipotent, triune, omnibenevolent deity? I mean, yeah, there is. I'm not saying it's perfectly clear, but it's just like, look, it's anything that's in the standard model of particle physics, right? Like, why don't we start with that and move out from there? Like, or, you know, things that supervene on that. I just don't understand what's so vague about the notion. Anyway, even if it is vague, you can still deploy a vague notion. Like tallness is vague. It doesn't mean you can't use it.
Separate conversation.
Yeah, it could be like spatio-temporal thing, but it could also be, it has the kinds of properties and activities that figure in our best scientific theory. But anyway, we can set that aside. He defines it as source physical. He defines it as source physicalism. So fundamentally, there are physical things, and if there are non-physical things, they are at least ultimately somehow explained by physical things. So that allows for dualism of all sorts and whatnot. So I think that's a helpful definition. But anyway, my point is that I think this is kind of a problem for both theists and atheists in the apologetics and online sphere, right? So I've gone on some apologetics channels, and they're like, if there is no God, then everything is just particles bashing into one another. And I'm like, no, please stop. Like, so I think it's on both sides where you kind of have this atheism associated.
What channel did you go on where they said that?
I don't think I should specify. I'm not going to specify.
You shouldn't, but I want to.
I think every channel that I listen to, the main ones, you know, Capture Christianity, Trinity Radio. To be fair, I don't think IP has said that, although he has. It's a different set of views. All the pre-sub channels, you know, they all say basically that point, or someone on them will make that argument. And I think it is important to point out that naturalism and atheism are very much not the same. You can be many different forms of atheism, and naturalism is not the only, or like reductive naturalism is not the only type. Now, I am a reductive naturalist, and I'm a big fan of that project, and that's what I want to push. But I think it is important people realize that it is only one form of atheism, and it's not incumbent on an atheist to defend that or any other particular form.
No.
Yeah,
okay.
I'll tell you in private message. But yeah, so it's
I don't know why he won't say.
It's kind of on both sides.
Unless it was in private,
we should get away from thinking that atheism
no, but he said it was on the
tied
channel.
to a kind of reductive materialist naturalism, and theism is tied to the other side.
Oh, there you go.
Naturalists can perfectly well accept all sorts of different kind of views, or atheists or what have you. They can accept all sorts of different views in philosophy of mind. They can accept non-reductionism in biology and in chemistry. They can even take a kind of Jonathan Schaeffer approach, where I know some people say Schaffer, where like the universe is prior to its fundamental constituents and whatnot. So there's a whole panoply of views that people can take, and we do need to get away from just conceiving of atheism as inherently bound up with this kind of reductive materialistic particles bashing into one another. Like, no, like we need to get away from that.
Okay, there's two more.
So the other thing I don't like about what he said there, I mean, I agree with the substance. I just don't like the implication in the tone or whatever that there's something wrong with reductive physicalism or materialism. I mean, you know, it doesn't sound like that's what Joe thinks, which is fine. I mean, most philosophers are naturalists, but that term does incorporate a large number of things. So it's hard to know how many reductive materials there. There's certainly a decent number, let me put it that way. So, you know, it's not a fringe view, or it's probably not a majority view. But I mean, the point is there that I don't think it's, I mean, you might not agree with it, but is it something that you talk about with disdain, or that it's like something that atheists have to fear? I don't know. Maybe I'm being a bit defensive here, but I just like, sure, atheism isn't reductive naturalism, but there's a perfectly fine form of atheism as far as I'm concerned. So as long as we're clear that there's a distinction, I don't really see the problem.
One comment just came in. I'm going to get
I mean, the interesting point is he didn't really answer the question, because the question is, what was the original question actually? Because I remember thinking he didn't answer, but maybe he kind of did answer it. What do you two think of atheists saddling themselves with the defense of full-blown atheism doesn't entail that? So I guess they sort of answered the second part. Yes, atheism doesn't entail about it. But they didn't answer the first part. What do you think of atheists who do decide to do that? And that includes me. Because I think it's much more interesting to present a positive view about reality than an entirely negative one. Again, I think it's okay to do that. I just think it's not as interesting. Atheism, like mere atheism, if you want to say, is kind of boring to me. I'm interested in like, well, finding out how the world actually is. Yeah, well, if that's the notion of what we're talking about in terms of materialism, then yeah, that might be what he has in mind there. But I mean, yeah, that's old school stuff. Anyway, so I feel like that first part of the question wasn't really answered. What about atheists who do decide to do that? Anyway, okay, there's a joke there. We can skip that. I mean, they're making fun of that, but I mean, they actually do say it's a good question, but for different kind of reasons. So.
The fact we don't have to give some kind of further account in terms of, let's say, properties. The nominalist says it's primitive fact. The realist says
they're arguing about
what explains this? Well, you help yourself to the exemplary chain, as it were. But that's primitive, just like I did. Why not stop?
Oh yeah, so what we take as primitives in our theories. Now, I don't accept that there need to be primitive in theories, but again, that puts me in a different set of views. It just annoys when people assert something as if it's a fact when it's just contingent on the views that they hold. Like you don't have. Accepting that there are such things as primitives is, in my opinion, a particular view about the notion of a particular theory of semantics and of the structure of knowledge, which I reject. I think about concepts as sort of a structuralism, I suppose, but as inherent in this web of beliefs you have connecting to each other and in use. And nothing is primitive because nothing is sort of defined wholly and independently and prior to everything else. I just don't think that's how it works. But anyway, that's a whole discussion for something else. I thought that was interesting.
Philosophical. Keep on asking it, new atheists.
Oh, I wouldn't go that far, Joe. I wouldn't go that far. I'd say just use it as like a start. Just continue thinking about it. Don't just ask it and think that you've like done. Yeah. Don't just ask it and think that you've done anything. Like use it as a way of like thinking about the two theories and weighing the arguments on both sides. I also don't want people to think that like you can just ask the question or say that like, okay, well, I land on this side and think that you've done anything. You've got to actually look at, reasons on both sides, because there are arguments for the existence of God. There are arguments for atheism that kind of like highlight the differences between the two. And so it's a good starting point. And I think that it's a good way of really, if you take it seriously, then you can use it as a way of getting deeper and looking at the potential, upsides of both views and the arguments for them. So that's what I would say. I wouldn't say just like ask it and you're done. But I don't think that's what you meant.
And you're done.
Yeah.
I had to end on a bang.
I mean, I basically agree there. You want to look for the best arguments for the different views, and you want to challenge yourself. There's nothing wrong with asking questions as long as you're willing to listen to the answer and be honest about that. Plus, there was something else I was going to say about that. Oh, yeah. So it is important to note that just saying that you adhere to this view X doesn't defend something. Like if I say I'm a naturalist, for example, that's not an argument. That's just me applying a label to myself. Likewise, saying that, you're a Molinist or you're a annihilationist or whatever, like that's not an argument. That is just applying a label. Now, that may be appropriate to do if that's all you're trying to do. You're just trying to highlight, look, I take that view, and so that's how I think about this, but I'm not going to defend it here. But I do see sometimes certain people have, maybe it's just an implication, but it's like just asserting the label of a position that you adhere to is somehow an argument for something. I mean, I guess strictly all it's an argument for is the fact that there are other views, and maybe that's sufficient in some purposes. But we just need to be cautious there. So I agree with what Cameron's saying in that respect. We're just about done here.
I made a joke in there. You didn't hear it.
There was one more super chat I wanted to.
And so definitely valuable / Capturing Christianity. Bag of cereal.
I'm
going to say one last. I'll
on Amazon. But
there's his book. I'll let him plug his book.
My book on Scientism. And a lot of people said that they really like that chapter,
I'll probably have to.
Yeah, it's just a matter
of that
on Amazon. But
slogans, because using it conversations in a way.
You got, there was a super chat. I can't find it. So in one sense, someone said he was a real Chad. I thought that was amusing.
If you really sit down and you really think of,
I must have skipped over it. I thought that was anyway.
Paul Draper, for instance.
I can't find it, but someone in the super chat said that Joe is a real Chad, which I thought is interesting. So there are a couple of super chats that were quite positive towards Joe. And I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. Clearly Cameron is lapping up. Remember that time where he says, like, keep going, keep going. Clearly there's a positive reception to what Joe is saying here, which is not surprising because he's been critical of atheism. I think I can stop sharing now. And I think that's interesting. I think it also relates to the fact that he's a declared agnostic, and there's generally a more positive reception to agnostics because they're seen as more open-minded, not dogmatic, and so forth. So I just think it's interesting sort of how that dynamic played out. Anyway, so, yeah, I could look at the transcript. So I always forget about that. Well, too late now. Also, I can't remember if I actually read it out, so the transcript won't say if it's just on the screen. Anyway, so let's summarize. This took a bit longer than expected, but that's fine. So ordinarily I'd go through what they all talk about, but I can't remember what all of the 6 mistakes were. One of them was Lacktheism. We looked at that extensively. I think that was mostly just gatekeeping. It's completely acceptable, in my opinion, to use Lacktheism as your notion of atheism, as long as you're clear about that and you recognize that it's somewhat non-standard in contemporary analytic philosophy. But it does have I think a perfectly fine pedigree, and I don't think the arguments Joe gave against it made much sense. So I don't have a problem with that. What else was there? Not appealing to good philosophy. Yes, we should strive for good philosophy, but not use that as a gatekeep against people engaging in conversation. What else there? What else was there? There was bugger. Those are the last two that they've talked about. I can't remember what the earlier ones were. What else did they talk about? So I know that Joe talked about Scientism. That was one of them. So we talked about that, and the main criticism that I had there was that Joe wasn't really clear about what he was critiquing. And I feel like, yes, a strong scientism, a sort of a crude form, I do disagree with and should be critiqued, but he wasn't very clear. And it felt like a lot of what he was saying, like science needs all these presumptions and needs to assume reliability of testimony and experience and memory and so forth. I just disagree with that, and I think that's the arguments given were highly suspect. I don't think that it needs to make any of those sorts of assumptions. So I spent quite a lot of time talking about that. Let's see. I think those are the main things we talked about. There were a few others. I don't remember Cameron's two others. But anyway, so I think that the main things that I wanted to respond to, though, were, the Lacktheism point and the Scientism point. Because I felt that they were really gatekeeperish and really just sort of presupposing a bunch of fairly specific views that you don't have to accept. And I think that these conversations really should be trying to bring people in and trying to meet people where they are and then elevate them, trying to encourage them to think more rigorously. And, have you considered this form of the argument? And, here's a thing you can read or video you can watch, rather than trying to push people away by saying that they're not smart enough or they're not well read enough. Or they're using the wrong labels or whatever to be engaged. So I really just liked this video from that point of view. The high amount of sort of gatekeeping there was, and also one of the most bizarre claims that Joe made was just that it's irrelevant what people believe. The only thing that matters is how good the arguments are. That may be true in the narrow sort of analytic philosophy journal publishing point of view, but that's not how people live. And if that was true, then if that was all there was, then why would you bother with philosophy anyway? Philosophy is supposed to be loving of wisdom, not loving of, lover of arguments published in peer-reviewed journals. Like they're not the same thing. And so I just found that a very strange comment. And we should be looking at these discussions from the point of view of where people, what they actually believe and what they believe, where they're starting from and what's important to them, and then trying to build on that, not trying to push them away because they use the wrong labels or they haven't read all the philosophers and haven't thought about it in the right way and so forth. So yeah, those are the main problems that I had with this video, as well as other more idiosyncratic objections that I had to points here and there. So hopefully you found this interesting. Again, the reason I respond to this is because these are supposed to be the biggest objections against atheism. So I don't think the Lacktheism thing is like the most important issue, but I do think it matters. I do think the gatekeeping point is very important, and that is something that I push repeatedly in a lot of the things that I talk about. I really dislike gatekeeping and intellectual elitism, ivory towerism. And I felt that a lot of the things that Joe was saying were either explicitly encouraging that or at least implicitly in that direction. So if Joe would like to come on at any point, or maybe we could go on Nathan's channel and have a chat about this stuff, I'd be more than willing to. I'd extend the same invitation to Cameron, although I significantly doubt that he would take me up on that. I also just don't think it's helpful to talk about like 3 biggest mistakes that atheists make. I mean, it's fine to be critical of atheists, but I don't know, it's just kind of clickbaity. Like, I probably wouldn't bother doing something like that for Christianity or theists, just because I just think it's kind of silly. Like, I don't know. I mean, I guess I clickbait a bit in my titles as well, but I don't like the whole approach of the video. So that combined with their arguments put me on the wrong foot. So hopefully you found this interesting and found some of the stuff I talked about of relevance. Stay tuned for more sort of these sort of discussions. Also feel free to check out my Science of Everything podcast, where I try to bring science to a broader audience. And thanks for listening, everyone. See you next time.